Long before the cities of Greece echoed with philosophy, and before Rome laid the stones of empire, there was a river, long and winding, ancient and generous. Along its fertile banks, shaded by palms and warmed by golden sun, the civilization of ancient Egypt slowly unfurled. In a land bordered by wide deserts and endless sky, life found its rhythm not through conquest, but through gentle cycles of water, planting, and time. The Nile, stretching thousands of miles from deep in Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, was more than a river. To the people of Egypt, it was a gift from the gods, a lifeline flowing through an otherwise inhospitable land, bringing with it the promise of food, renewal, and harmony. Every year the Nile would rise, its waters swelling with the summer rains from far-off highlands. When the river flooded its banks, it left behind a thick layer of dark silt, rich in nutrients and perfect for growing crops. This annual inundation, known as Akhet, was welcomed with rituals and prayers. It marked not destruction, but rebirth. Fields were prepared, seeds planted, and hopes renewed. This rhythm guided the Egyptian calendar, dividing the year into 3 seasons: Akhet, the flood; Peret, the time of growth; and Shimu, the harvest. This cycle had continued for thousands of years, predictable and serene, its quiet power shaping a culture rooted in balance and devotion to natural order. The earliest Egyptians were not builders of pyramids, but simple farmers, herders, and artisans. In small villages of mud brick homes, they rose with the sun, worked the land, and honored the world around them. Over time, as the needs of society grew, so did its complexity. Leadership formed, trade developed, and knowledge deepened. What had once been scattered communities slowly gathered into one unified kingdom, and with unification came the first stirrings of grandeur, the foundations of a civilization that would one day awe the world with its temples, its tombs, and its timeless mysteries. At the heart of Egyptian thought was the concept of Maat, a word that meant more than just balance or truth. It was the essence of harmony in the universe. Maat was the ideal of the cosmos made visible in human life, and it permeated everything from the justice system to the way temples were aligned with the stars. Pharaohs were charged not simply with ruling, but with upholding Maat, maintaining the sacred order of things. To live in accordance with this balance was to be in tune with the will of the gods, and through rituals, offerings, and acts of kindness, the Egyptians sought to preserve this sense of cosmic alignment in their daily lives. This deep reverence for order and continuity can be felt in the way they built their homes, shaped their art, and conducted their prayers. Even the great pyramids, constructed with such precision and scale, were not monuments of ego, but reflections of a society deeply connected to the eternal. Their angles mirrored the rays of the sun, their alignment followed the stars, and inside, hidden away in long corridors of stone, the bodies of kings rested in hopes of rebirth, not in this world, but in the next. But before we explore those grand structures and sacred tombs, we linger for a while in the quieter spaces of early Egyptian life. Along the banks of the Nile, water buffalo graze, and birds circle overhead. Farmers guide wooden plows drawn by oxen, while women grind grain into flour and prepare dough for baking. Children chase one another through fields of barley, and fishermen cast their nets into gentle currents. Life here is not hurried, but rhythmic, shaped by the sun, the soil, and the stars above. In their art and writing, we find images of lotus flowers and papyrus reeds, cats curled in the shade, and scenes of family gatherings and daily labor. These moments, preserved in faded pigments on tomb walls and pottery shards, remind us that even in the shadow of great monuments, life was filled with ordinary beauty. As we drift further into this world, we begin to understand that the greatness of ancient Egypt lies not only in its pyramids or legendary kings, but also in the delicate fabric of everyday existence. It is the hush of early morning as the sun lifts over the river. It is the smooth motion of a potter shaping clay by hand. It is the scent of incense rising from a household shrine and the laughter of children skipping stones across the water. These are the quiet echoes of a civilization built not just to endure, but to honor the mystery and rhythm of life itself. And so, our journey begins, not with fanfare, but with stillness, with the gentle movement of a river and the warm touch of sunlight on ancient soil. In the coming hours, we will explore the heights of Egyptian knowledge, the secrets of their gods and temples, the intricacies of their writing and belief. But for now, we remain here, in the gentle heart of the Nile Valley, where time seems to slow, and where history begins its long, steady whisper beneath the golden sun. As the Nile flowed northward, so too did the threads of power begin to weave their way through the land. In time, the scattered communities of early Egypt gradually gave rise to two distinct regions. Upper Egypt in the south, where the river snakes through narrow valleys between cliffs of limestone, and Lower Egypt in the north, where the waters broaden into the rich, fan-shaped delta. Each region developed its own customs, symbols, and ways of life, yet both shared a common bond in the Nile's gifts. For generations they existed as neighboring yet separate lands, twin souls of a single river. But as settlements grew and trade deepened, unity beckoned. Around 3100 BCE, tradition tells of a powerful ruler named Nama, also known by some as Menes, who brought Upper and Lower Egypt together into one harmonious kingdom. He is often considered the first pharaoh, and his unification marked the beginning of Egypt's first dynasty. Though the exact details remain hidden in the mists of antiquity, the significance of this act resonated for centuries. A single ruler now stood at the head of a vast, fertile land, claiming divine authority as the earthly embodiment of the gods. From this point on, the king of Egypt was more than a man. He became a bridge between the mortal and the eternal, a living god who bore the weight of Maat on his shoulders. This concept of divine kingship is one of the most distinctive features of ancient Egyptian life. The pharaoh was not worshipped in the way a deity might be in myth, but rather understood as the vessel through which divine order flowed into the world. Each king inherited the sacred duty to maintain harmony, to ensure that the floods came, the crops thrived, the temples remained strong, and the rituals were performed with care. In art and statuary, the pharaoh was always shown in ideal form, strong, youthful, composed. These images were not portraits in the modern sense, but expressions of eternal truth, the way a king ought to appear in a world governed by balance and cosmic law. As the early dynasties took root, a distinct visual language began to emerge. Hieroglyphs, which had likely evolved from earlier symbolic markings, blossomed into a rich system of writing. These beautiful pictorial signs were not merely functional, they were sacred, believed to carry divine power. Scribes trained for years to master the complex script, which adorned temple walls, tombs, monuments, and official decrees. Writing was a gift from the god Thoth, patron of wisdom, and those who wielded it were deeply respected. Alongside this writing came the birth of artistic and architectural styles that would remain consistent for thousands of years. Temples were built with symmetry and intention, aligned with stars or sunrise. Statues were carved with poise and stillness, capturing not a fleeting moment, but an idealized essence of divine presence. Even in these earliest periods, the Egyptians showed a remarkable ability to organize large labor forces, manage resources, and coordinate across vast distances. These were not crude beginnings, but a sophisticated foundation that would support one of history's most enduring cultures. And yet, even as royal courts formed and great monuments began to rise, the rhythms of everyday life continued with familiar steadiness. Farmers still tended their plots by the river, fishermen still cast their nets at dawn, bakers and brewers worked by the warmth of the hearth. These parallel worlds, one of divine kingship, the other of simple, grounded routine, existed in harmony, each reinforcing the other in a web of spiritual and social connection. The role of the pharaoh was both spiritual and practical. He led military campaigns when needed, settled disputes, and oversaw massive building projects. But he also performed sacred rituals, dressed in ceremonial garments, and offered prayers on behalf of the people. His crowns told stories too. The white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt were often depicted together as the double crown, symbolizing the unity he was sworn to preserve. Each time a new king ascended to the throne, his name was inscribed in a cartouche, an oval loop symbolizing eternity, and added to a long lineage stretching back to Nama, anchoring his place within the eternal order. In these early dynastic periods, Egypt's capital was established in the city of Memphis, strategically located at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt. From there, the pharaohs governed a realm that stretched along the Nile's gentle course. Though the deserts on either side were vast and forbidding, the narrow strip of green land by the river was vibrant with life. Towns and villages, temples and granaries, fields and orchards. Trade flourished up and down the river, carried by boats of wood and reed, their sails billowing softly in the desert breeze. As the centuries passed, the Egyptians began to build not just for the present, but for eternity. Tombs grew more elaborate, crafted to preserve the body and spirit for an afterlife they believed was as real as the world of the living. Artisans developed new techniques in stone carving, painting, and architecture, while priests expanded their understanding of the gods and the rituals that honored them. The idea of permanence, of creating things that would last beyond a single lifetime, became a guiding principle in all things. In a land where the sun rose and set with reliable grace, and the river brought life in its eternal return, it made sense to dream of a world that never truly ended. And so, as we follow the rising arc of early Egyptian civilization, we move gently now toward one of its most astonishing feats, the construction of the pyramids, those silent sentinels of stone that have watched over the desert for thousands of years. These monuments did not arise suddenly, but emerged from the steady hands and sacred minds of those who believed deeply in the power of memory, legacy, and the eternal return of life. In the dry, quiet lands where the desert meets the edge of the fertile valley, great forms began to rise. At first, they were modest, simple mud-brick tombs known as mastabas, low and rectangular, their name drawn from the Arabic word for bench. But as generations passed and belief deepened, these tombs began to transform. One level was placed atop another, then another, until the shape resembled a staircase reaching into the sky. And with this quiet innovation, the first pyramid was born, not as a grand design all at once, but as the slow unfolding of a dream etched in stone. The man credited with this transformation was Imhotep, a wise and visionary figure who served as chancellor to Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty, around 2700 BCE. More than just a builder, Imhotep was an architect, a priest, a physician, and a scholar. His design for the step pyramid at Saqqara, Egypt's first large-scale stone monument, marked the beginning of a new era in how Egyptians honored their kings and approached the mysteries of death. Rising in distinct tiers, the pyramid echoed the idea of ascension, guiding the pharaoh's soul toward the heavens. Around it, a complex of courtyards, temples and chapels unfolded in a sacred pattern, forming not just a tomb, but a portal between worlds. With time and ambition, the stepped form evolved. Pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty took on an even greater challenge, the construction of smooth-sided pyramids, geometric and gleaming beneath the desert sun. Among them was the great pharaoh Khufu, who commissioned what would become one of the most astonishing architectural feats in all of human history, the Great Pyramid of Giza. It stands to this day on the Giza Plateau, quiet and immovable, a mountain of carefully placed stone blocks numbering in the millions. Though the precise techniques remain a subject of study and fascination, what is clear is that its construction required extraordinary organization, deep knowledge of engineering, and the labor of thousands, not slaves, as is sometimes imagined, but skilled workers who lived in nearby communities, well-fed, respected, and part of something greater than themselves. The Great Pyramid was not built in isolation. Nearby, two other pyramids rose for Khufu's successors, Khafre, whose pyramid retains remnants of its original limestone casing at the peak, and Menkaure, smaller but equally graceful in design. Together, these structures formed a sacred landscape, accompanied by causeways, temples, and the serene figure of the Great Sphinx, its lion's body and human face still weathering the wind in silent watch. Though time has softened their edges and scattered their outer stones, the pyramids endure as symbols not of death, but of continuity, of the soul's eternal journey and the human longing to be remembered. The building of a pyramid was more than a construction project. It was a sacred act, rooted in the Egyptians' understanding of life, death, and the cosmos. The very orientation of the pyramids, aligned with cardinal directions and celestial movements, spoke to their creators' deep knowledge of astronomy and ritual. Inside, narrow passageways led to burial chambers, where the pharaoh's body, carefully preserved through the art of mummification, would rest in silence, surrounded by protective spells, amulets, and offerings. These tombs were not places of mourning, but of preparation, gateways to the Duat, the realm of the dead, where the soul would face trials, transformations, and ultimately rebirth. The workers who built these structures were part of something much larger than themselves. Archaeological discoveries at Giza have revealed the presence of well-planned worker villages, complete with bakeries, breweries, medical centers, and housing. These were skilled laborers, masons, engineers, transporters, cooks, working in seasonal shifts, contributing to the king's eternal home in a spirit of devotion and civic pride. Far from scenes of oppression, this was a landscape of coordinated effort, spiritual intent, and communal strength, shaped by belief in the sacred duty of building for eternity. For the Egyptians, the pyramid symbolized not only royal power, but cosmic harmony. Its broad base and narrowing summit mirrored the primeval mound of creation, the sacred hill that, according to myth, first rose from the waters of chaos. At the peak, the pharaoh's soul would ascend, joining the sun god Ra on his daily voyage across the sky. To live was to prepare for death, and to die was to rise again, not in sorrow but in serene continuation. This idea guided the design of tombs, the choice of burial goods, the recitation of texts, and the crafting of ritual. Every detail, no matter how small, held meaning. As centuries passed, the scale and frequency of pyramid building shifted. Later pharaohs chose different forms, new materials, and distant sites. Yet the ideals born in this early period, permanence, balance, spiritual elevation, remained central to the Egyptian worldview. The pyramids, rising from the sand like quiet memories, remind us that time is both fleeting and eternal. Stone erodes, dynasties fade, but belief endures. And so as we gaze upon these great structures, we do not merely see the ambition of kings. We see the hands of countless individuals, the hush of desert mornings, the glint of sunlight on polished limestone. We feel the stillness of chambers deep within the earth, and the gentle hope that life continues beyond its final breath. As our journey continues, we follow this same path of transition from the world of the living into the realm of gods and spirits, where the Egyptian vision of the afterlife unfolds in sacred detail and tender imagination. Beyond the sunlit world of the Nile and the living, the ancient Egyptians imagined another realm, quiet and vast, stretching beyond the western horizon, where the sun dipped each evening into shadow. To them, this descent was not an end, but a passage. Just as the sun disappeared only to rise again with the dawn, so too could the soul move beyond death and return renewed. This deep belief in the cycle of life and rebirth shaped every element of Egyptian culture, especially their rich and reverent understanding of the afterlife. The Egyptians called the realm of the dead the Duat, a mysterious space that existed both beneath the earth and beyond the sky, invisible but ever-present. It was a place of passage and testing, of divine encounters and symbolic trials. Yet it was not conceived with dread. Instead, the afterlife was envisioned as a continuation of life's joys, a serene mirror of the Nile Valley, where the righteous might till peaceful fields, feast with loved ones, and live in the gentle presence of the gods. Death was not a departure from life's meaning, but an entry into a deeper, more harmonious form of it. To reach this realm, however, the soul, known as the Ba, had to be prepared. The process of death was not only spiritual but physical, and the body had to be carefully preserved to ensure the soul's safe return. This is where the practice of mummification took on such central importance. The Egyptians believed that preserving the body helped anchor the soul, allowing it to recognize its vessel and return to it each night, even in the afterlife. Over centuries, the art of mummification evolved from simple wrappings to elaborate techniques, involving careful removal of internal organs, drying the body with natron salts, and wrapping it layer by layer in linen, often with protective amulets tucked among the folds. Organs were placed in canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were kept safe, while the heart, believed to be the seat of memory, emotion, and morality, was often left in place or lovingly preserved for the great judgment that awaited. The brain, curiously, was considered less essential and was typically removed through the nose and discarded, its role not yet fully understood in ancient thought. Once the body was prepared, it was placed within a series of nested coffins, sometimes elaborately painted with scenes and spells, then sealed within a tomb filled with offerings. These included food and drink, clothing, tools, and small carved figures known as shabti, who were meant to serve the deceased in the next world. Sometimes entire books of protective spells, such as the Book of the Dead, were placed nearby, scrolls of papyrus covered in sacred texts, designed to guide the soul safely through the trials of the Duat. The most significant moment in the journey through the afterlife was the weighing of the heart, a gentle but decisive test before the god Osiris, ruler of the underworld. The heart of the deceased was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth and cosmic order. If the heart was light, unburdened by wrongdoing, the soul could pass peacefully into the field of reeds, a lush, sunlit realm of eternal contentment. But if the heart was heavy with guilt, it would be devoured by a fearsome creature called Amit, ending the soul's journey forever. This image, though striking, was not meant to terrify, but to remind the living of the value of a virtuous life in tune with truth, kindness, and reverence. The gods who watched over this passage were not distant or harsh. They were close and personal, their presence woven into daily life. Osiris, green-skinned and wrapped in white linen, was the compassionate judge who had once walked the earth as a beloved king. Isis, his wife, was a symbol of healing and fierce devotion, whose magic restored her husband's life after betrayal. Anubis, the jackal-headed guide, tended the bodies of the dead with solemn grace, overseeing embalming and leading the soul through darkness with gentle care. These deities were protectors as much as judges, companions as much as overseers. Tombs themselves were often built with symbolic alignment, with the setting sun, the stars of Orion, or the sacred constellation of Sirius. Walls were painted with scenes of daily life, harvests, banquets, and hymns of praise. These were not simply memorials, but living texts meant to sustain the spirit through eternity. In the Valley of the Kings, hidden tombs carved deep into the rock would later replace the grand pyramids, offering pharaohs more secrecy and security, but the purpose remained the same: to provide a doorway through which the soul could pass gently into the realm beyond. Even ordinary Egyptians, those without royal status, shared in these beliefs, adapting rituals to their means. A humble tomb might hold only a few offerings, a simple painted jar, or a small figurine, but the intent was the same: to honor life by preparing carefully for what came after. This quiet devotion, repeated across centuries and social classes, created a spiritual culture of deep intimacy and continuity. The fear of death, so present in many other ancient cultures, seemed softened here, not denied, but transformed into something beautiful, structured, and filled with hope. As we leave the dim corridors of tombs and return to the light of the living world, we carry with us this serene vision, a belief that life's story does not end, but continues along a gentle, sacred curve. And so we step once more into the warmth of the Nile Valley, where temples rise like prayers turned to stone, and where the gods await not in distant heavens, but in the hush of incense, the flicker of torchlight, and the breath of a ritual softly spoken at dawn. As the sun rose each morning over the eastern horizon, spilling gold across the still waters of the Nile, another day began in the sacred life of ancient Egypt. This was not just the renewal of light, but the rebirth of divine energy flowing from the sky into the earth, awakening temples and tombs alike with its silent warmth. For the Egyptians, the rising sun was more than a celestial event. It was a moment of communion with the gods. And nowhere was this connection felt more deeply than in the great temples that lined the river's path, anchored like beacons of devotion in the shifting sands of time. Temples in ancient Egypt were not places for public worship in the modern sense. Instead, they were sacred domains where priests performed daily rituals to maintain harmony between the mortal world and the divine. They were the dwelling places of gods, each one dedicated to a specific deity whose essence was believed to inhabit a hidden statue kept deep within the temple's inner sanctuary. These spaces were designed not merely as buildings, but as cosmic microcosms, where every wall, column, and courtyard echoed the patterns of creation and the celestial order. As we step into these sacred spaces, the coolness of shaded stone wraps gently around us. Towering pylons rise before us at the entrance, their massive walls decorated with scenes of kings offering tribute to the gods, carved in quiet detail and softened by centuries of sun. Beyond the entrance, open courtyards lead inward, gradually narrowing into shadowed halls filled with lotus-shaped columns. Light filters down in golden shafts, catching the faint shimmer of colored paint still clinging to old carvings, soft blues, faded reds, the echo of what once was vibrant and new. Each temple was aligned with precision. Some faced the sunrise on a particular day of the year, such as a solstice or the birthday of a god. Others mirrored the constellations above, forming part of a sacred geometry that extended from heaven to earth. In this way, the temples were both physical and spiritual maps, designed to guide not only the living, but the divine forces that moved through the world, ensuring that the rhythm of the cosmos was honored and maintained. Inside the temples, a hidden world of ritual unfolded in gentle silence. The priests, chosen from elite families and trained in sacred knowledge, would enter the inner sanctum at dawn. They washed the statue of the god, anointed it with oil, dressed it in fine linen, and offered incense, bread, beer, and flowers. These acts were not symbolic but literal. They were seen as nourishing the god's spirit and reinforcing the divine presence that protected Egypt. Each gesture, performed in precise order, was an expression of Ma, the cosmic harmony that held all things together. Among the most celebrated temple complexes was that of Karnak, in Thebes, a vast and awe-inspiring site that grew over centuries into a forest of columns and sanctuaries. Dedicated primarily to Amun, the hidden god of the air and wind, Karnak was a living temple, continually expanded by successive pharaohs. Its great hypostyle hall, with 134 massive columns towering high above the stone floor, is like walking through a man-made grove, silent and reverent, where light and shadow drift like slow-moving clouds. Here, one could almost hear the hush of ancient prayers still lingering in the cool air between the pillars. Not far from Karnak stood the Temple of Luxor, its axis aligned with the Nile and the stars. Every year, a great festival called Opet was held, during which the sacred statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were carried in ceremonial boats from Karnak to Luxor, reenacting divine journeys and renewing the bond between gods, kings, and people. The procession was quiet yet joyful, marked by music, incense, and chants, a river-born celebration of balance and blessing. Other temples dotted the land, from the monumental structures at Abu Simbel in the far south, carved directly into the cliffs, to the delicately preserved Temple of Hathor at Dendera, where celestial ceilings still shimmer with star charts and goddess faces. Each temple, no matter how grand or modest, was a sanctuary of stillness. In the hush of their halls, one could feel the gentle touch of time, a rhythm slower than speech, deeper than stone. Even outside the temple walls, the influence of these sacred spaces flowed into daily life. Farmers offered small prayers in the fields, carving protective symbols into their tools. Mothers whispered the names of goddesses over newborns. Artisans shaped amulets and tokens to carry the blessings of the divine. The temple was the heart of a living faith, beating softly through the lives of all who dwelled along the Nile. And so we walk, slowly, through these spaces of devotion, past crumbling statues whose eyes still gaze toward eternity, under lintels worn smooth by centuries of quiet feet. We feel the cool of shade, the warmth of sun, the whisper of wind through columns once touched by the hands of kings and priests. Here, time does not rush, it expands, it echoes, it waits. As we leave the temples behind, we return once more to the people who built, visited, and sustained them. In the next part of our journey, we'll step gently into the world of daily life, the homes, markets, and simple pleasures of ordinary Egyptians, whose quiet routines gave shape and substance to one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. As the sun rose each morning over the eastern horizon, spilling gold across the still waters of the Nile, another day began in the sacred life of ancient Egypt. This was not just the renewal of light, but the rebirth of divine energy flowing from the sky into the earth, awakening temples and tombs alike with its silent warmth. For the Egyptians, the rising sun was more than a celestial event. It was a moment of communion with the gods. And nowhere was this connection felt more deeply than in the great temples that lined the river's path. Anchored like beacons of devotion, in the shifting sands of time. Temples in ancient Egypt were not places for public worship in the modern sense. Instead, they were sacred domains where priests performed daily rituals to maintain harmony between the mortal world and the divine. They were the dwelling places of gods, each one dedicated to a specific deity whose essence was believed to inhabit a hidden statue kept deep within the temple's inner sanctuary. These spaces were designed not merely as buildings, but as cosmic microcosms, where every wall, column, and courtyard echoed the patterns of creation and the celestial order. As we step into these sacred spaces, the coolness of shaded stone wraps gently around us. Towering pylons rise before us at the entrance, their massive walls decorated with scenes of kings offering tribute to the gods, carved in quiet detail and softened by centuries of sun. Beyond the entrance, open courtyards lead inward, gradually narrowing into shadowed halls filled with lotus-shaped columns. Light filters down in golden shafts, catching the faint shimmer of colored paint still clinging to old carvings, soft blues, faded reds, the echo of what once was vibrant and new. Each temple was aligned with precision. Some faced the sunrise on a particular day of the year, such as a solstice or the birthday of a god. Others mirrored the constellations above, forming part of a sacred geometry that extended from heaven to earth. In this way, the temples were both physical and spiritual maps, designed to guide not only the living, but the divine forces that moved through the world, ensuring that the rhythm of the cosmos was honored and maintained. Inside the temples, a hidden world of ritual unfolded in gentle silence. The priests, chosen from elite families and trained in sacred knowledge, would enter the inner sanctum at dawn. They washed the statue of the god, anointed it with oil, dressed it in fine linen, and offered incense, bread, beer, and flowers. These acts were not symbolic but literal. They were seen as nourishing the god's spirit and reinforcing the divine presence that protected Egypt. Each gesture, performed in precise order, was an expression of Ma, the cosmic harmony that held all things together. Among the most celebrated temple complexes was that of Karnak in Thebes, a vast and awe-inspiring site that grew over centuries into a forest of columns and sanctuaries. Dedicated primarily to Ammon, the hidden god of the air and wind, Karnak was a living temple, continually expanded by successive pharaohs. Its great hypostyle hall, with 134 massive columns towering high above the stone floor, is like walking through a man-made grove, silent and reverent, where light and shadow drift like slow-moving clouds. Here one could almost hear the hush of ancient prayers still lingering in the cool air between the pillars. Not far from Karnak stood the Temple of Luxor, its axis aligned with the Nile and the stars. Every year, a great festival called Opet was held, during which the sacred statues of Ammon, Mut, and Khonsu were carried in ceremonial boats from Karnak to Luxor, reenacting divine journeys and renewing the bond between gods, kings, and people. The procession was quiet yet joyful, marked by music, incense, and chants, a river-borne celebration of balance and blessing. Other temples dotted the land, from the monumental structures at Abu Simbel in the far south, carved directly into the cliffs, to the delicately preserved Temple of Hathor at Dendera, where celestial ceilings still shimmer with star charts and goddess faces. Each temple, no matter how grand or modest, was a sanctuary of stillness. In the hush of their halls, one could feel the gentle touch of time, a rhythm slower than speech, deeper than stone. Even outside the temple walls, the influence of these sacred spaces flowed into daily life. Farmers offered small prayers in the fields, carving protective symbols into their tools. Mothers whispered the names of goddesses over newborns. Artisans shaped amulets and tokens to carry the blessings of the divine. The temple was the heart of a living faith, beating softly through the lives of all who dwelled along the Nile. And so we walk slowly through these spaces of devotion, past crumbling statues whose eyes still gaze toward eternity, under lintels worn smooth by centuries of quiet feet. We feel the cool of shade, the warmth of sun, the whisper of wind through columns once touched by the hands of kings and priests. Here, time does not rush. It expands, it echoes, it waits. As we leave the temples behind, we return once more to the people who built, visited, and sustained them. In the next part of our journey, we'll step gently into the world of daily life. The homes, markets, and simple pleasures of ordinary Egyptians, whose quiet routines gave shape and substance to one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. In a land so deeply devoted to harmony and balance, it comes as no surprise that artistry and craftsmanship were cherished forms of devotion. The temples, tombs, and monuments that still rise from the desert sands were not created by kings alone, but by countless quiet hands. The painters, sculptors, scribes, and builders whose skilled labor transformed vision into stone, pigment, and line. These were the artisans of ancient Egypt, and though their names are seldom remembered, their work remains as steady and serene as the Nile itself. Many artists and craftsmen lived in a special village west of Thebes, on the edge of the Valley of the Kings. This was Deir el-Medina, a community purpose-built for those tasked with designing and decorating the royal tombs hidden in the cliffs. Secluded yet comfortable, the village housed generations of artisans who labored with care and precision in service of the afterlife. They were respected and well supported, receiving regular deliveries of grain, water, oil, and pottery, along with time to rest, worship, and raise families. Some even had small shrines within the village, dedicated to the gods or to their own ancestors. Each day, teams would walk the winding path into the valley, descending into tomb shafts carved deep into the limestone. Here, in cool shadow far from the sunlit fields, the work of creation began. Walls were smoothed, outlines sketched in red ink, corrections made in black. Scenes were planned with symmetry, not to capture individual likenesses, but to reflect spiritual truth and idealized eternity. Once approved, the paintings were filled with vibrant pigments, deep ochre for skin, cobalt blues for sky, and river, verdant green for rebirth, black for the fertile soil and the still silence of the afterlife. Brushes were made from reeds, their tips chewed into soft bristles. The style was both precise and poetic, figures in profile, each motion graceful, each hand carefully placed. In addition to painters, there were sculptors who shaped statuary from hard stone, basalt, granite, alabaster, coaxing form from the silence of the quarry. Even small figurines, like the protective Ushabti placed in tombs to serve the deceased, were crafted with tender detail. Every curve held meaning, every gesture was deliberate. To create an image of the gods or the dead was to participate in a sacred act, not merely to depict, but to invoke, to preserve, to honor. Perhaps most vital of all were the scribes, the keepers of knowledge, the recorders of time. In a society where writing was both art and magic, the scribe held a special place. He might serve in a temple, at court, in an estate, or on a construction site, noting the movement of goods, recording prayers, transcribing treaties, or documenting offerings. His tools were simple: a wooden palette with grooves for black and red ink, a bundle of reed pens, a roll of papyrus. Yet with these he wrote the words that built and bound the kingdom. The hieroglyphic script, so elegant and intricate, was not merely phonetic. It combined sound, symbol, and sense, a language of image and rhythm. Some signs were pictorial, others abstract, and many held double meanings. To read and write fluently required years of training, often beginning in childhood at a house of life, the name given to temple libraries and schools. There, under the guidance of elder scribes, students copied passages from sacred texts, practiced calligraphy, and memorized hymns, laws, and mathematical problems. Scribes were also the authors of wisdom literature, reflective writings filled with moral guidance and philosophical musings. These gentle texts, often written as advice from a father to a son, offered practical and spiritual reflections on how to live with dignity, patience, and awareness. They spoke of the importance of silence, of listening before speaking, of avoiding excess, and of being kind in the face of hardship. Such teachings reflect the tone of the civilization itself, measured, thoughtful, steady. Even as the highest monuments soared into the sky, the tools that made them, the brushes, chisels, pigments, and pens, remained humble. It was through simple materials and practiced hands that the sacred was made visible. Artists and scribes did not see their work as personal expression, but as acts of service to the gods, the king, the people, and the cosmic order of things. And yet, despite their modesty, they left behind a legacy of astonishing beauty. In painted tombs we see banquets and boat rides, musicians and dancers, harvest scenes and moments of intimacy. These images remind us that the Egyptians, for all their focus on eternity, were also deeply rooted in life's pleasures and textures. They celebrated not only kings and gods, but also fishermen casting nets, weavers spinning flax, and families gathered beneath fig trees. As we leave the workshops and writing rooms behind, the walls still echo with the quiet scrape of stylus on stone, the soft breath of paint brushed into plaster. These are the sounds of a civilization crafting its soul, not in haste, but in harmony. And now we move gently forward into the realm of myth, where the gods of Egypt walk, not in abstraction, but in stories told beneath star-filled skies, their presence felt in the wind, the water, and the hush of the temples at dusk. In the hush of twilight, when the heat of the day faded and the river glowed softly under the deepening sky, stories would pass gently from one voice to another, quiet legends, sacred truths wrapped in poetic form. These were the myths of ancient Egypt, not confined to temple scrolls or hidden texts, but carried in the minds of farmers, craftsmen, and priests alike. They were not merely tales of long ago, but living mirrors of the world, explanations of the stars, the floods, the cycles of life and death, the quiet forces that moved behind the scenes of the visible world. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and layered, a family of divine beings whose roles were deeply entwined with nature and daily existence. Some gods were universal, their influence felt across all of Egypt, while others were local, tied to specific towns or regions. And yet, none were remote. They were close at hand, inhabiting statues, drifting on incense smoke, listening in moments of stillness. Their presence was not something apart from life, but woven into it, a comforting thread of familiarity and guidance. At the heart of the Egyptian mythological cycle was the story of Osiris, the gentle god of the afterlife. Once a great and just king, Osiris ruled the earth with wisdom and compassion. But his jealous brother Set, the god of chaos and storms, sought power for himself. In one of the most enduring myths of the ancient world, Set deceived and murdered Osiris, sealing him in a coffin and scattering his body across the land. Grief-stricken but determined, Osiris's wife and sister, the goddess Isis, searched unceasingly for his remains. With the help of her magic and devotion, she reassembled his body, breathed life back into him, and conceived their son, Horus. Osiris did not return to the world of the living, but became the lord of the underworld, a serene and noble figure who judged the souls of the dead. His story, retold in temples and tombs, was more than myth. It was the framework through which Egyptians understood loss, resurrection, and the promise of eternal life. In Osiris's journey, they saw their own, a movement from life through death to something quieter, deeper, and everlasting. Horus, the falcon-headed god, inherited his father's cause, eventually defeating Set in a great struggle for order over chaos. He became the protector of kings, his sharp gaze watching over the land from the heights of the sky. Every pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, ensuring that divine justice, Ma'at, would be preserved with every generation. And so the myth of Osiris and Horus was not simply about gods, it was about kingship, morality, and the fragile yet enduring thread of balance. Other gods brought their own colors to the canvas of belief. Ra, the sun god, was among the most ancient, a radiant figure who sailed across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. Each morning, he rose from the horizon in his solar bark, and each evening he descended into shadow, only to be reborn again with the dawn. This daily cycle mirrored the journey of the soul and the rhythm of life itself. Thoth, with the head of an ibis, was the god of writing, wisdom, and the moon. He recorded the judgments of the dead and was believed to have invented hieroglyphs, offering knowledge and clarity to those who sought understanding. Hathor, the gentle cow goddess of joy and motherhood, was called Mistress of the West, welcoming the dead into the afterlife with music and warmth. Bastet, the cat goddess, was both protector and nurturer, her image found in countless homes and amulets, bringing comfort and safeguarding the hearth. One of the most curious and intimate deities was Bes, the lion-faced dwarf god. Though he never appeared in grand temples, he was beloved by ordinary Egyptians. Guardian of sleep, childbirth, and music, Bes was a joyful, watchful presence, carved on bedposts, painted on cosmetic jars, and worn as protective charms. His wide eyes and sticking-out tongue were thought to scare away evil spirits and bring laughter to the home. In him we see how the divine in Egypt was not always solemn. Sometimes it was playful, domestic, and delightfully strange. Unlike many other mythologies, the Egyptian religious world was not rigidly hierarchical or exclusive. The gods could merge, shift, or be understood in different ways depending on place and time. Amen could become Amen-Ra, the lioness Sekhmet might transform into the gentle Bastet. This fluidity reflected the Egyptian view of the world itself as layered, mysterious, and multifaceted, always in motion, but gently held together by the thread of Ma. Rituals, festivals, and quiet acts of devotion brought these myths to life. In grand ceremonies, sacred statues were paraded on boats, mimicking divine journeys across the sky or the underworld. In smaller acts, a child's first haircut might be dedicated to a protective god, or a family might whisper a prayer as they lit a lamp at dusk. The myths lived not just in stories, but in rhythms, in seasons, in gestures, in the very flow of time. And so, mythology in ancient Egypt was not a set of tales to be told, but a lens through which all things were seen: life and death, joy and sorrow, order and chaos. These stories were not merely remembered, they were reenacted, painted, spoken, and believed with quiet conviction. They offered comfort, guidance, and a sense of shared belonging among the people, the gods, and the eternal patterns of the universe. As our journey continues, we follow this sacred current further still, toward the powerful women of Egypt, both divine and mortal, whose voices echo through history with grace, wisdom, and strength. In Queens, priestesses and goddesses, we'll find new dimensions of the Egyptian world, each one as calm and enduring as the river that gave this civilization life. In the calm, sun-warmed world of ancient Egypt, the role of women was not hidden in the shadows, but gently interwoven into the structure of society, visible in homes, in temples, and sometimes even on the throne itself. Unlike many ancient cultures, Egypt offered its women a range of freedoms and roles, allowing them to own property, manage businesses, inherit wealth, and participate in religious life. And in the figures of queens, priestesses, and goddesses, we find a reflection of a civilization that, while shaped by hierarchy and tradition, also honored the quiet strength and enduring presence of the feminine. One of the most celebrated and powerful women in Egyptian history was Hatshepsut, a queen who rose to become pharaoh in her own right during the 18th dynasty. Initially ruling as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, she gradually took on full royal titles and symbols, even adopting the traditional false beard worn by male pharaohs. But her reign, which lasted more than 2 decades, was marked not by conquest but by peace, prosperity, and breathtaking construction. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, carved into the cliffs of western Thebes, remains one of the most elegant architectural achievements of ancient Egypt, a place of terraces, columns, and harmony with the surrounding landscape. Hatshepsut's legacy was not one of upheaval, but of quiet assertion, a demonstration that kingship, in Egypt's sacred structure, could rest not solely in male form, but in the one who upheld Ma'at, the divine balance. In her inscriptions, she often emphasized her divine birth and the approval of the gods, particularly Ammon, whose oracles supported her rise. Though later kings tried to erase her from the historical record, chiseling away her images and name, time has restored her place with quiet clarity. Her story remains a testament to both resilience and grace. Other royal women, too, left deep impressions. Nefertari, wife of Ramses II, was honored with a beautifully decorated tomb in the Valley of the Queens, its walls painted with delicate scenes of her journey through the afterlife, guided by deities and glowing with soft color. Her titles included Great Royal Wife and Mistress of Charm, and her influence extended into diplomacy and temple patronage. Tai, mother of Akhenaten, played a significant political and religious role during one of Egypt's most unusual periods, her strong features appearing alongside kings and gods in statues and reliefs. And Nefertiti, the enigmatic queen known for her iconic bust, stood beside Akhenaten in reshaping the religious landscape of Egypt, if only for a time. Beyond the palace walls, Egyptian women also held respected roles as priestesses, musicians, and administrators within temple life. The position of God's wife of Ammon, held by high-ranking women, often of royal blood, carried both ritual and economic power. These women presided over ceremonies, managed estates, and lived within temple precincts, honored not only for their lineage, but for their spiritual purity and devotion. The presence of women in religious roles was not limited to high-born elites. Across Egypt, women served as singers, dancers, and caretakers in temples both great and small, their voices rising in praise, their movements part of sacred rhythm. And woven throughout this society were the images and influences of goddesses, divine figures who embodied love, protection, magic, and cosmic power. Isis, perhaps the most beloved of all, was a mother, healer, and protector, her devotion to Osiris and Horus echoing the deepest values of family and loyalty. She was called upon in childbirth, in healing rituals, and in funerary rites, her presence both celestial and maternal. Hathor, goddess of music, joy, and motherhood, offered comfort to the living and a gentle welcome to the dead. With her cow horns cradling the solar disk, she symbolized both nourishment and cosmic grace. Her temples, especially at Dendera, overflowed with beauty, star-studded ceilings, painted pillars, and carved music scenes honoring the happiness she brought. Other goddesses held fierce strength. Sekhmet, the lioness, brought fire and protection, her wrath feared but her healing revered. In ritual, she was calmed with offerings of beer and music, her dual nature reflecting the balance of creation and destruction. Nephthys, quiet sister of Isis, moved silently through funerary spaces, guarding the dead and comforting mourners. Nut, a powerful sky goddess and consort of Amun, represented the maternal spirit of kingship. These divine women were not passive, they were guardians, makers, healers, and rulers, their forms adorning temples and amulets, their names whispered in prayer. Even in the everyday world, Egyptian women took pride in their appearance and presence. They wore linen garments of fine weave, often pleated and tied with simple cords. Jewelry, made from gold, faience, and colored stones, adorned necks, wrists, and ears. Mirrors of polished bronze and coal pots, made from alabaster-lined dressing tables, alongside scented oils and combs of carved ivory. Beauty was not vanity, but a form of care, an offering to the self and to the divine, part of the order that made life harmonious. As we reflect on these lives, of queens and goddesses, of mothers and priestesses, we see not only individual strength, but a cultural recognition of balance. Masculine and feminine, earthly and divine, royal and domestic, all existed in relationship, forming the complete shape of Egyptian life. And as the river flows steadily between its banks, so too did Egyptian society find strength in its symmetry. Now, as we continue along this gentle path, we follow the movement of kingship through time, into the golden age of empire, when Egypt expanded its borders, built new monuments, and saw the height of its wealth and influence. But even in this period of splendor, the quiet presence of the past remained, steady as the river, enduring as the stars above. As the centuries passed, the Nile continued its timeless course, nourishing the land and guiding the people who lived beside it. And with time, the patterns of Egyptian history began to shift once more. After periods of uncertainty and internal change, a new era dawned, one that would bring the civilization to the height of its power, wealth, and artistic achievement. This was the New Kingdom, a span of nearly 500 years, beginning around 1550 BCE, marked not only by majestic temples and military success, but by the steady flowering of culture, diplomacy, and devotion. It was Egypt's golden age, and yet beneath its grandeur, the soul of the civilization remained calm and contemplative. The New Kingdom began with the rise of the 18th dynasty, following the expulsion of foreign rulers known as the Hyksos. Under the leadership of strong, determined kings such as Ahmose II and Thutmose II, Egypt regained control of its territory and began to expand its borders beyond the traditional bounds of the Nile. These campaigns were not marked by reckless conquest, but by carefully managed growth, a way to secure trade routes, maintain stability, and bring distant peoples into a shared cultural orbit. Among the most celebrated pharaohs of this era was Thutmose III, often referred to as Egypt's Napoleon for his military acumen. Yet for all his campaigns, he also invested deeply in temples, botanical gardens, and the arts. His reign left a lasting legacy, not through war alone, but through the quiet flowering of intellectual and spiritual life. Then came Amenhotep III, under whose rule Egypt reached the peak of its wealth and international prestige. His court was one of elegance and ceremony, where foreign dignitaries arrived bearing tribute, and scribes recorded every detail in graceful script. Massive construction projects, including the stunning Luxor temple and the once colossal mortuary temple at Kom el-Hitan, marked the landscape with a sense of divine order and permanence. Amenhotep's reign was one of peace, prosperity, and cultural openness, a time when Egypt's voice echoed softly across the ancient world. But perhaps the most curious chapter of the new kingdom came under his son Akhenaten, who introduced a religious revolution that still intrigues historians today. Abandoning the traditional pantheon, he focused worship on a single deity, the Aten, or sun disk, and moved the capital to a new city called Akhenaten, now known as Amarna. His art style became more naturalistic and fluid, his inscriptions more poetic. Depictions showed the royal family in tender, intimate scenes beneath the life-giving rays of the Aten. Yet the change was too sudden, too stark, and after his death, the old gods quietly returned, their temples reopened, their rituals restored. It was during this period of religious transition that Tutankhamun, the boy king, took the throne. Though his reign was short and largely unremarkable in policy, the discovery of his nearly intact tomb in 1922 brought him quiet immortality. Nestled in the Valley of the Kings, his burial chamber, filled with golden treasures and protective charms, remains a time capsule of the new kingdom's artistry and belief. The golden mask that once lay upon his face is perhaps the most recognized image of ancient Egypt, serene, symmetrical, and beautifully still. Later came Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, who ruled for more than 60 years and left his mark across the land with statues, temples, and inscriptions proclaiming his legacy. His temple at Abu Simbel, carved into the cliffs above the Nile in Nubia, features 4 colossal seated statues of the king himself, gazing outward with eternal calm. Each morning, the rising sun enters the temple, illuminating the inner sanctuary on specific days of the year. Such careful alignment reflects the Egyptians' deep understanding of time, light, and sacred space. Despite the size of his monuments, Ramses was not merely a builder of stone, he was also a builder of peace. After years of tension with the powerful Hittite Empire, Ramses concluded one of the world's earliest recorded peace treaties, inscribed on temple walls and exchanged in 2 languages. His legacy, though shaped by self-promotion, reflects a balance of strength and diplomacy, ambition and continuity. But even at the height of its empire, Egypt remained tethered to the past, not in nostalgia, but in reverence. The rituals of temple life continued undisturbed. Scribes copied the same sacred texts with careful precision, and the eternal order of the gods remained at the center of all things. Farmers still rose with the sun, artists still painted lotus flowers on tomb walls, and children still played beside the river. The core values of the civilization, harmony, reverence, patience, persisted like the soft flow of water through a stone-cut channel. As the new kingdom matured, it absorbed influences from abroad, new styles, new goods, new words, yet its essence stayed rooted in the old ways. From the highest court to the smallest village, life moved in cycles, each day echoing those that came before, each generation tending the flame of a civilization that had always seen time as a wheel, not a line. And so, as we walk through the golden halls of the new kingdom, we see not only power and wealth, but care, the careful stewardship of tradition, the graceful balance between innovation and memory. In the next part of our journey, we will follow the gentle curve of history into the later dynasties, when challenges grew more complex and foreign influences deepened. Yet even then, in changing times, the old spirit of Egypt, quiet, enduring, luminous, would remain. As the golden age of the New Kingdom slowly began to wane, Egypt entered a time of subtle transformation. The grandeur of temples still stood, the language of hieroglyphs still flowed from the pens of scribes, and the rhythms of village and field continued as they had for generations. Yet beyond the walls of the temple courtyards and the calm of the Nile's banks, the world was changing. The strength of the pharaohs began to falter, regional governors grew more independent, and new powers stirred on the edges of the kingdom's reach. Even so, Egypt did not collapse suddenly. It shifted, gradually, gracefully, and at times with quiet resilience. The period that followed the New Kingdom is often referred to as the Third Intermediate Period, and it was marked by a more fractured political landscape. Dynasties rose and fell in various parts of the country. Power was shared, sometimes uneasily, between kings in the north and priesthoods in the south, particularly the influential priests of Amun at Thebes. While the central authority weakened, local traditions remained strong. The temples of the gods continued to function, sacred festivals were held with care, and art retained its familiar stylized grace. Though the unity of empire had faded, the spiritual and cultural fabric of Egypt remained largely intact, quietly enduring beneath the surface of political change. It was during these centuries that Egypt saw a more regular presence of foreign influence, not as sudden invasions, but as steady tides, traders, travelers, and eventually rulers from beyond the desert and sea. Libyan chiefs settled in the western delta and gradually integrated into Egyptian society. They adopted the customs, titles, and rituals of the pharaohs, blending their own heritage with the deep-rooted traditions of their adopted land. Later, Nubian kings from the south, especially during the 25th dynasty, brought renewed devotion to Egyptian religion and temple building, seeking not to replace the old ways but to uphold them. The Nubians, in particular, saw themselves as restorers of true Egyptian values. From their capital in Napata, they reigned as pharaohs, dressing in traditional garments, speaking the ancient tongue, and commissioning temples in honor of Amun. One of the most notable was Piye, whose inscriptions reveal a king not only proud of his victories, but reverent in his worship and deeply respectful of Egypt's sacred past. His successors, too, left behind graceful pyramids and stelae carved in classical style, reminders that Egypt's cultural strength lay not in rigidity, but in its ability to absorb and refine outside influences while maintaining its core identity. As the centuries continued, other powers would come to rule Egypt. First, the Assyrians, whose brief and forceful campaigns left only shallow footprints, and later the Persians, who brought the land into their vast imperial system. Yet even under foreign rule, the Egyptian way of life persisted. Local officials still carried out rituals. Artists still painted with traditional symbolism. Farmers still watched the Nile rise and fall. The temples remained living places, their inner sanctuaries still glowing with incense and whispered prayers. And then in the late 4th century BCE, a new chapter unfolded with the arrival of Alexander the Great. Sweeping down from Macedonia, he entered Egypt not as a conqueror in the usual sense, but as a welcomed figure, declared son of Amun by the oracle at Siwa, embraced by priests, and honored as a pharaoh. He ordered the founding of a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, which would become one of the most important cultural centers of the ancient world. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy established a new dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemaic dynasty was a fascinating fusion of Greek and Egyptian traditions. The royal court spoke Greek, followed Hellenistic customs, and established institutions such as the Library of Alexandria, a vast collection of texts and knowledge from across the known world. Yet the Ptolemies also respected Egyptian religion. They built temples in traditional style, dressed as pharaohs in relief carvings, and supported the priesthood. The result was not a simple replacement of culture, but a gentle layering of new customs atop old foundations. Among the most iconic figures of this era was Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic line. Fluent in both Greek and Egyptian, she styled herself as a reincarnation of the goddess Isis, and her reign was one of diplomacy, intellect, and bold vision. Though her story is often told through the lens of Roman politics and tragedy, she was, above all, an Egyptian queen, deeply connected to the rituals, symbols, and identity of her land. Her death in 30 BCE marked the end of pharaonic rule. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, becoming a distant yet valuable province. Temples still functioned for a time, priests still recited hymns, but the slow twilight had begun. And yet, even as hieroglyphs faded from memory and the old gods gave way to new beliefs, something gentle and enduring remained. For over 3,000 years, Egypt had grown, changed, and adapted, yet always returned to its central truths: the river, the sun, the afterlife, the sacred balance of matter. These remained, flowing quietly beneath each new layer of history. And as we drift gently onward in our journey, we will soon explore how Egypt's legacy lived on, not just in stone and story, but in memory, myth, and the enduring beauty that still draws the world's gaze. As the golden age of the New Kingdom slowly began to wane, Egypt entered a time of subtle transformation. The grandeur of temples still stood, the language of hieroglyphs still flowed from the pens of scribes, and the rhythms of village and field continued as they had for generations. Yet beyond the walls of the temple courtyards and the calm of the Nile's banks, the world was changing. The strength of the pharaohs began to falter, regional governors grew more independent, and new powers stirred on the edges of the kingdom's reach. Even so, Egypt did not collapse suddenly. It shifted, gradually, gracefully, and at times with quiet resilience. The period that followed the New Kingdom is often referred to as the Third Intermediate Period, and it was marked by a more fractured political landscape. Dynasties rose and fell in various parts of the country. Power was shared, sometimes uneasily, between kings in the north and priesthoods in the south, particularly the influential priests of Amun at Thebes. While the central authority weakened, local traditions remained strong. The temples of the gods continued to function, sacred festivals were held with care, and art retained its familiar stylized grace. Though the unity of empire had faded, the spiritual and cultural fabric of Egypt remained largely intact, quietly enduring beneath the surface of political change. It was during these centuries that Egypt saw a more regular presence of foreign influence, not as sudden invasions, but as steady tides, traders, travelers, and eventually rulers from beyond the desert and sea. Libyan chiefs settled in the western delta and gradually integrated into Egyptian society. They adopted the customs, titles, and rituals of the pharaohs, blending their own heritage with the deep-rooted traditions of their adopted land. Later, Nubian kings from the south, especially during the 25th dynasty, brought renewed devotion to Egyptian religion and temple building, seeking not to replace the old ways but to uphold them. The Nubians, in particular, saw themselves as restorers of true Egyptian values. From their capital in Napata, they reigned as pharaohs, dressing in traditional garments, speaking the ancient tongue, and commissioning temples in honor of Amun. One of the most notable was Piye, whose inscriptions reveal a king not only proud of his victories, but reverent in his worship and deeply respectful of Egypt's sacred past. His successors, too, left behind graceful pyramids and stelae carved in classical style, reminders that Egypt's cultural strength lay not in rigidity, but in its ability to absorb and refine outside influences while maintaining its core identity. As the centuries continued, other powers would come to rule Egypt. First the Assyrians, whose brief and forceful campaigns left only shallow footprints, and later the Persians, who brought the land into their vast imperial system. Yet even under foreign rule, the Egyptian way of life persisted. Local officials still carried out rituals. Artists still painted with traditional symbolism. Farmers still watched the Nile rise and fall. The temples remained living places, their inner sanctuaries still glowing with incense and whispered prayers. And then in the late 4th century BCE, a new chapter unfolded with the arrival of Alexander the Great. Sweeping down from Macedonia, he entered Egypt not as a conqueror in the usual sense, but as a welcomed figure, declared son of Ammon by the oracle at Siwa, embraced by priests, and honored as a pharaoh. He ordered the founding of a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, which would become one of the most important cultural centers of the ancient world. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy established a new dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemaic dynasty was a fascinating fusion of Greek and Egyptian traditions. The royal court spoke Greek, followed Hellenistic customs, and established institutions such as the Library of Alexandria, a vast collection of texts and knowledge from across the known world. Yet the Ptolemies also respected Egyptian religion. They built temples in traditional style, dressed as pharaohs in relief carvings, and supported the priesthood. The result was not a simple replacement of culture, but a gentle layering of new customs atop old foundations. Among the most iconic figures of this era was Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic line. Fluent in both Greek and Egyptian, she styled herself as a reincarnation of the goddess Isis, and her reign was one of diplomacy, intellect, and bold vision. Though her story is often told through the lens of Roman politics and tragedy, she was, above all, an Egyptian queen, deeply connected to the rituals, symbols, and identity of her land. Her death in 30 BCE marked the end of pharaonic rule. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, becoming a distant yet valuable province. Temples still functioned for a time, priests still recited hymns, but the slow twilight had begun. And yet, even as hieroglyphs faded from memory and the old gods gave way to new beliefs, something gentle and enduring remained. For over 3,000 years, Egypt had grown, changed, and adapted, yet always returned to its central truths: the river, the sun, the afterlife, the sacred balance of matter. These remained, flowing quietly beneath each new layer of history. And as we drift gently onward in our journey, we will soon explore how Egypt's legacy lived on, not just in stone and story, but in memory, myth, and the enduring beauty that still draws the world's gaze. Within the temples of ancient Egypt, towering columns and massive gates spoke to the grandeur of divine presence. Yet, beyond the temple walls, in the soft spaces of homes, gardens, and riverbanks, belief took on a quieter form, personal, tender, and deeply embedded in daily life. For the ancient Egyptians, the sacred was not reserved for high ceremony alone. It lived in symbols, in charms worn against the skin, in whispered prayers offered before sleep. Their spiritual world was not distant or abstract, but close, tactile, and present in every room and every breath. Central to this deeply personal form of devotion were amulets, small objects of power and protection, shaped from stone, metal, or glazed faience. These delicate tokens, often worn on cords or sewn into clothing, carried the blessings of gods, the strength of animals, and the memory of myth. To wear an amulet was to invite harmony into one's life, to guard against misfortune, or to draw near the qualities of a favored deity. Among the most beloved was the ankh, the symbol of life itself. Shaped like a looped cross, the ankh appeared in paintings and carvings as a divine gift, often extended by gods to the noses of pharaohs or held gently in the hand. Its form was simple, yet its meaning profound: the breath of life, the promise of renewal, and the quiet endurance of the soul. Another powerful image was the Eye of Horus, also known as the Wedjat Eye. Said to have been restored by the god Thoth after Horus lost it in battle, the eye became a sign of healing and wholeness. Its curved lines, shaped like falcon markings, symbolized protection, insight, and completeness. It was worn by the living and placed with the dead, painted on boats and carved into amulets, its presence a watchful companion through all phases of existence. Scarab beetles, too, held sacred meaning. Inspired by the dung beetle that rolls balls of earth across the ground, the scarab became a symbol of transformation, rebirth, and the rising sun. In myth, the beetle was associated with the god Khepri, who pushed the sun across the sky each morning. Scarab amulets were worn to ensure safe passage through life's transitions: birth, travel, illness, death, and inscribed with prayers or spells on their flat undersides. These symbols were not merely decorative, they were part of a language, visual, spiritual, and immediate. Their power was believed to lie in both their form and their material. Some were made of turquoise or lapis lazuli, colors of sky and water. Others were crafted in glazed blue faience, a luminous material that shimmered like the Nile under moonlight. Each was chosen with care, placed close to the body, tucked beneath linens, or hidden inside the folds of the deceased's wrappings as a safeguard for the journey ahead. Rituals, too, were quietly embedded in the rhythm of life. Not only the great temple ceremonies, but smaller acts repeated in homes, at thresholds, and in fields. Farmers might mark the start of the flood season with prayers and offerings at local shrines. Families left bread, beer, and incense at the doorways of tombs during feast days, speaking the names of the dead to keep them alive in memory. Pregnant women carried charms shaped like Taurat, the protective hippopotamus goddess of childbirth, her rounded belly and lion paws symbolizing both nurture and strength. In daily grooming, spiritual care was never far away. Kohl was applied not only for beauty or to guard the eyes from glare, but also as a sacred protection, a line drawn between the wearer and unseen harm. Oils and perfumes, made from myrrh, lotus, and frankincense, were rubbed onto the skin in gentle rituals of healing, purity, and preparation. Each act was layered, practical, personal, and spiritual all at once. The home itself could become a sacred space. Many houses included small altars where figures of household gods were kept, sometimes a seated Osiris, a serene Isis, or the joyful face of bees carved into furniture or painted above a bed. These figures were not remote icons, but comforting presences, watched over with care, spoken to in times of need or gratitude. Even the layout of the tomb, often seen as the final home, reflected a deep sense of ritual structure. Rooms and passages were aligned to reflect the journey of the sun and the soul. Painted scenes depicted idealized visions of daily life: fields forever green, fish leaping from the river, gatherings of family, all eternal, all serene. The tomb was not a place of sorrow, but of transition. And through sacred symbols and carefully spoken words, the deceased was equipped not just with supplies, but with meaning. Spells and prayers, drawn from sacred texts such as the coffin texts, the pyramid texts, and the Book of the Dead, were recited or inscribed to guide and protect the soul. These texts did not tell a single story, but offered a collection of affirmations, instructions, and hymns, poetic, powerful, and rich with metaphor. "I have not committed sin," begins the famous negative confession, spoken during the weighing of the heart. "I have not stolen bread. I have not closed my ears to truth." These quiet statements, spoken not for judgment, but for remembrance, reflect the Egyptian belief that to live well was to live in balance, to honor not only gods, but others. In every amulet, in every ritual, there was the same thread, a gentle striving toward harmony. The Egyptians did not seek to control the world, but to live within its rhythms, to honor its cycles, and to shape their days in accordance with the sacred flow of time. Their symbols remind us not of fear or command, but of care, of a civilization that believed deeply in tending, protecting, and preserving all that was good and balanced in the world. As we move onward, we will next explore the quieter arts, music, poetry, and the rhythms of leisure, where joy, beauty, and celebration wove their way into the daily lives of the people. In these softer expressions, we'll find the tender heartbeat of a culture deeply attuned to the spirit of life itself. In the calm of twilight, when the fields were quiet and the last boats of the day glided silently along the river, the people of ancient Egypt often turned to music. Soft melodies drifted from courtyards and temple precincts, carried on the breeze like incense. Harps were strummed with gentle fingers. Flutes gave breath to silence. Rattles shook in time with footsteps, and voices rose, not always loudly, but with steady warmth. Music in ancient Egypt was more than entertainment. It was a language of the heart, an offering to the gods, a companion to labor, a balm to sorrow, and a celebration of life. In temples, music accompanied ritual. The sistrum, a sacred rattle shaped like an open arch, was shaken by priestesses in the worship of goddesses such as Hathor and Isis. The delicate jingling sound was believed to drive away evil and invite blessing. Temple musicians also played flutes, lutes, and drums, their instruments crafted from wood, leather, and reeds, their songs echoing between carved columns and painted walls. These sounds were not merely background, they were prayers in vibration, rhythmic devotions that brought harmony to the sacred moment. Beyond the temple, music was part of everyday life. Workers sang in the fields and at construction sites, keeping time with their tools. Fishermen hummed as they cast their nets. Mothers sang lullabies while rocking their children to sleep. At feasts, musicians performed with grace and humor, and dancers moved in fluid patterns, arms lifted like wings, fingers snapping softly, steps measured but free. Their movements often echoed the forms of nature, flowing water, flying birds, the swaying of palm fronds in the wind. To dance in Egypt was not only to entertain, but to express joy, to honor life through the body's own rhythm. Poetry, too, had a cherished place in Egyptian culture, woven into songs, carved into tombs, and spoken softly in both private and public moments. Some verses were sacred, part of funerary texts and temple hymns. Others were secular, love poems, reflections on nature, or philosophical musings on the passing of time. One gentle genre, sometimes referred to as songs of the harpist, offered quiet reflections on life's fleeting beauty. These poems, often carved into tomb walls or found in burial papyri, encouraged the reader to enjoy the present moment, to cherish love, friendship, and simple pleasures, even as they acknowledged life's impermanence. One such poem might read, "Put perfume upon your head, clothe yourself in fine linen, anoint yourself with the true delights of life. Do not let your heart grow weary. Follow your heart and your happiness." These gentle lines, written more than 3,000 years ago, speak in a tone that still feels familiar, a soft reminder to live fully, with kindness and gratitude. Egyptian poets often spoke of the natural world in their verses, comparing lovers to lotus flowers, or describing the rippling of the river as the laughter of the gods. Nature was not something separate or distant. It was part of the poetic soul of the people, ever present, ever inspiring. Leisure in ancient Egypt was simple, seasonal, and deeply satisfying. Families gathered in the shade of fig trees or on rooftops cooled by evening air. They told stories, played games like Senet, and shared cups of beer flavored with dates or honey. Children played with toys shaped like animals, rolled hoops, and splashed in the shallows of irrigation canals. On festival days, music and dance filled the streets, and food was prepared in abundance: roasted meats, sweet pastries, and fruits served alongside wine or freshly brewed beer. Festivals themselves were expressions of both reverence and delight. Entire communities would participate, decorating boats, lighting torches, and parading sacred statues along river routes. At Opet, for example, the image of our moon was carried from Karnak to Luxor amid singing, dancing, and offerings. These festivals were not somber affairs. They were vibrant, filled with laughter and celebration, moments when the boundaries between gods and people, sacred and ordinary, seemed to soften into shared joy. In wealthier households, leisure might also involve art, reading, or gardening. Paintings show quiet scenes of women playing music in garden pavilions, attended by servants offering cool drinks or fragrant flowers. These gardens, planted with sycamores, papyrus, and water lilies, were more than displays of luxury. They were expressions of harmony, small reflections of paradise, mirroring the ideal landscape of the afterlife. And yet, even in humbler homes, leisure had its place. A clay pot filled with cool water, a bit of shade on a hot day, a song shared between neighbors. These were moments of peace. The Egyptians understood that rest was not wasteful, but essential. It honored the body, nurtured the spirit, and reflected the sacred rhythm of life itself: work and pause, sound and stillness, light and shadow. As we sit with these softer moments, a harp gently strummed, a poem read at dusk, the flicker of torchlight during a festival night, we feel the soul of ancient Egypt, not in its monuments alone, but in its music, its laughter, its quiet love for beauty. And from here we'll continue onward into the practical wisdom of their world, how the Egyptians studied the stars, counted the days, and healed the body, bringing order to the mysteries that surrounded them with gentle care and thoughtful observation. Beneath the ever-turning sky, ancient Egyptians looked upward, not with fear, but with calm attention. The stars, the moon, the shifting patterns of sunrise and shadow were all part of a great rhythm, one that could be studied, understood, and gently woven into the fabric of life. To live in harmony with the world was not only a spiritual pursuit, but a practical one. And so, quietly and patiently, the Egyptians developed ways of marking time, tending to the body, and navigating both land and sky with wisdom rooted in observation. Time in ancient Egypt flowed like the Nile, cyclical, steady, and nourishing. The Egyptians observed the changes in light, in seasons, in the flooding of the river, and from these rhythms, they crafted one of the earliest known calendars, dividing the year into 3 distinct seasons: Akhet, the season of inundation; Peret, the season of emergence; and Shemu, the season of harvest. They created a structure that reflected both agricultural needs and spiritual understanding. Each season held 4 months, and each month was broken into 3 10-day weeks. These 30-day months formed a 360-day year, with 5 additional days known as the epigomenal days added at the end, days considered sacred, marking the birthdays of key gods such as Osiris, Isis, Horus, Seth, and Nephthys. Observing the stars was central to this sense of time. The rising of Sirius, known to the Egyptians as Soptit, just before dawn in midsummer signaled the start of the new year and foretold the coming of the Nile's flood. This celestial event, so dependable and bright, became a cornerstone of the Egyptian calendar, linking heaven and earth in a shared rhythm. Temples were aligned with precision to star paths and solstices, and sacred texts recorded lists of decans, star groupings that rose in succession each night, helping priests track the hours through the darkness. Mathematics, too, found its place in temple schools and scribal texts. Though the Egyptians did not pursue abstract theory as later cultures would, they developed a remarkably effective system for practical use, managing land, dividing grain, constructing buildings, and tracking time. Their system used unit fractions, with special signs for common values, and hieroglyphic symbols to represent whole numbers in clear, repeating patterns. Multiplication and division were often done through duplication and combination, not unlike how one might build something from smaller, repeated parts. Geometry, born of necessity in a land where fields were remeasured after every flood, allowed surveyors and builders to plan temples, tombs, and pyramids with astonishing accuracy. Right angles were created using knotted cords, and builders understood how to balance symmetry, weight, and proportion. This knowledge, passed quietly from master to apprentice, shaped not only the grandeur of monumental structures, but also the harmony of homes, gardens, and shrines. Healing, like timekeeping, was a blend of observation and belief. The Egyptians saw the body as a sacred whole, both physical and spiritual, and illness as a disruption of harmony rather than a single, isolated event. Physicians, called swandwe, trained in temple libraries and often worked alongside priests, combining practical remedies with ritual invocations. Their knowledge was recorded in papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which described conditions, treatments, and surgical techniques with quiet detail. Medical treatments included herbal infusions, poultices, and salves made from ingredients like garlic, honey, myrrh, and crushed minerals. Honey was prized for its antibacterial qualities. Moldy bread, surprisingly, was sometimes used on wounds, a natural precursor to the idea of antibiotics. Procedures were described with both observation and intuition, setting broken bones, treating toothaches, even performing rudimentary surgeries. For each remedy, there was often a corresponding spell or prayer, not in contradiction to the treatment, but as part of a whole. Healing came from the hands, the heart, and the gods in tandem. Women served as midwives and healers as well, tending to childbirth with care and spiritual protection. Incantations were recited, amulets hung near the bed, and deities such as Taret and Bees were invoked to guard mother and child. Pregnancy tests were even developed using grains and observation, a method surprisingly accurate, now known to respond to hormonal changes. Among the more subtle aspects of Egyptian science was their understanding of balance and flow. The concept of Ka, the life force, and Ba, the personality or soul, informed not just theology but medicine. The heart was seen as the seat of emotion, memory, and morality, an organ to be preserved and protected. The body's internal passages were compared to the irrigation canals of the Nile, channels through which life must flow freely. When these channels were blocked, sickness arose, and so through diet, ritual, and natural remedies, Egyptians sought to restore health as they would restore a field, gently, patiently, and with reverence. Throughout all of this, the watching of stars, the mixing of herbs, the shaping of numbers, the Egyptian approach was never hurried. It was thoughtful, observant, and deeply rooted in trust in patterns, in nature, in the continuity of things. They saw the world not as a place of chaos to be conquered, but as a place of order to be understood and honored. Their sciences were born not of urgency, but of wonder. As we move onward in our journey, we'll next turn toward Egypt's relationship with the wider world, through trade, diplomacy, and gentle exchange, seeing how the rhythms of the Nile extended outward, carried in goods, stories, and shared knowledge to distant lands beneath different stars. Though Egypt's heart beat along the steady course of the Nile, its vision extended far beyond the reach of its own horizon. From the earliest dynasties to the height of its empire, Egypt maintained a quiet but powerful presence on the stage of the ancient world, not only through conquest or rule, but through gentle exchanges of goods, materials, ideas, and belief. Its merchants, diplomats, and sailors traveled through desert paths and over open waters, guided by stars and wind, linking Egypt to distant lands with a thread of mutual curiosity and quiet cooperation. The Nile itself served as the central artery of Egyptian commerce. From the delta in the north to Nubia in the south, goods moved steadily in boats shaped like birds or crescent moons. Their curved hulls and tall sails caught the breeze as they drifted past fields of wheat and groves of date palms. Pilots navigated by experience and landmarks, using poles in shallow waters and watching for signs of weather on the open stretch of river. The current carried them north, the wind brought them south, a natural balance that made round trips both possible and dependable. Within Egypt, trade connected cities and regions across the narrow strip of fertile land. Farmers brought barley, flax, and vegetables to market. Artisans sold pottery, textiles, and painted jars. Scribes traded in scrolls, ink, and amulets. Markets bustled with quiet energy, set in open courtyards, shaded by woven canopies. People bartered, exchanged, and measured out goods using standard weights in the form of stone and metal, overseen by scribes who recorded transactions on slips of papyrus or ostraka, shards of pottery used as writing surfaces. But Egypt's reach extended beyond its own borders. To the south, it traded extensively with Nubia, a land of dark stone, flowing cataracts, and deep cultural ties. From Nubia came gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animal skins, treasures that were prized not only for their material value, but for their symbolic richness. Gold, especially, was considered the flesh of the gods and was used in temple statues, funerary masks, and sacred jewelry. The Nubians also brought incense and fine craftsmanship, and over time, the two cultures grew closely linked, with Egyptian temples rising in Nubian lands and Nubian kings ruling in Egyptian ones. To the east, across the rugged Red Sea hills, caravans of donkeys and camels made their way through desert passes toward Punt, a mysterious land rich in myrrh, frankincense, aromatic woods, and exotic animals. The journey to Punt, whether over land or by ship, was long and difficult, but it held a sacred allure. The most famous expedition was ordered by Queen Hatshepsut, whose temple walls at Deir el-Bahari record scenes of graceful ships arriving at the lush shores of Punt, greeted by its rulers and laden with treasures. These carvings, rows of incense trees, bundles of fragrant resin, and curious animals, reflect not only trade, but fascination, a quiet respect for distant lands, and the gifts they offered. To the north and west, Egypt traded with the peoples of the Levant, Mesopotamia, and later, the Aegean world. From these regions came silver, cedar wood, olive oil, wine, and fine pottery. Egyptian goods in turn traveled outward: papyrus, linen, glass beads, carved stonework, and grain. Egypt was often known as a land of abundance, especially in its exports of wheat and barley, which were traded for luxury items or given as part of diplomatic exchanges. Letters from the Amarna archive, a collection of clay tablets written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the day, reveal how Egypt maintained relationships through correspondence with kings of distant lands. These letters, written with a blend of courtesy and shrewdness, include offers of marriage alliances, requests for gold, and expressions of friendship. One king addresses the pharaoh as "my brother," another asks for physicians and magicians from Egypt, renowned for their skill. These exchanges reflect a world where diplomacy was both practical and poetic, where power was shared not only through armies, but through gifts, words, and gestures. Egyptian sailors also traveled the Mediterranean coast, reaching ports in Byblos, Crete, and Cyprus. There they encountered new materials and ideas, technologies in shipbuilding, tools, and art that would slowly integrate into Egypt's own traditions. The influence was mutual. Egyptian motifs appeared in far-off lands, just as foreign styles began to appear in Egyptian frescoes and pottery. Even in tombs, objects from abroad were placed with care: a jar from Canaan, a mirror from Anatolia, a lapis lazuli scarab from the East. Trade was not merely economic, it was cultural. Each shipment carried more than objects. It carried stories, practices, and ways of thinking. Musicians from foreign lands performed at royal courts. Exotic animals were gifted to temples or palaces. Foreign deities were sometimes honored in hybrid form, their names joining Egypt's pantheon in quiet partnership. The boundaries of belief and tradition, though strong, were not rigid. Egypt welcomed and absorbed what it found useful or beautiful, always shaping it with its own enduring sense of balance. Even the language of art and writing reveals these quiet connections. Loan words from Semitic languages appear in Egyptian texts. Paintings show dancers with foreign dress and style. Hieroglyphs were used to phonetically spell the names of foreign visitors, weaving them gently into the record of time. Egypt's openness was never loud. It was steady, thoughtful, and deeply selective, always guided by the principle of preserving harmony while engaging with the wider world. As we drift onward through this era of exchange, we begin to see ancient Egypt not as an isolated marvel, but as a living part of a broader ancient network, a land whose calm rivers met distant seas, whose sacred breath carried across mountains and deserts, whose name was spoken with respect in languages far from its own. In our next chapter, we will return once more to the quiet heart of things, to the symbolism of animals and the sacred role they played in belief, protection, and identity. In fur, feather, and scale, the Egyptians saw not only nature, but the divine made visible. Across the warm sands and fertile fields of ancient Egypt, animals moved in gentle rhythm with the people, hunting, grazing, nesting, and swimming, in the same quiet landscapes that shaped every facet of life. But to the Egyptians, these creatures were never seen as merely background to human activity. They were signs, companions, and messengers, reflections of the divine, embodiments of specific traits, and bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. From the tiniest beetle to the majestic lion, each animal held meaning. Each form, each habit, each cry in the night was part of a sacred language waiting to be read. Many of Egypt's gods were closely associated with animals, their forms depicted with both human and animal features, not to suggest transformation, but to represent qualities that transcended the ordinary. The falcon, swift and sharp-eyed, became the symbol of Horus, the sky god and protector of kingship. His wings stretched across temple carvings and protective amulets, his gaze vigilant over sacred spaces. In art, Horus appears with a falcon's head, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, a figure of clarity, vision, and divine authority. The ibis, with its curved beak and quiet presence near the water's edge, represented Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. Ibis birds, often seen in wetlands along the Nile, stood in serene stillness, thoughtful, observant. Thoth, as scribe of the gods and keeper of knowledge, was sometimes also shown as a baboon, another creature believed to greet the sun with morning cries. Both animals became symbols of learning and time, gentle reminders of cycles, calendars, and intellectual care. One of the most beloved animals in Egyptian belief was the cat. Sleek, alert, and mysterious, cats were both protectors and companions. In homes, they kept grain stores free from mice and snakes. In temples, they were revered for their grace and poise. The goddess Bastet, often depicted with the head of a lioness or domestic cat, embodied both maternal gentleness and fierce protection. To welcome a cat into the home was to invite harmony and ward off misfortune. So revered were these animals that harming a cat, even accidentally, was considered a grave offense. Some families even mummified their feline companions, placing them gently beside offerings in tombs, wrapped in linen and love. Lions, powerful and rare, represented Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and healing. Her roar was fierce, her presence commanding, yet she also brought medicine and restoration. In times of plague or illness, Sekhmet was both feared and honored, her image invoked to calm the storm within. To worship her was to seek both strength and balance, the courage to fight and the wisdom to heal. Crocodiles, often feared for their sudden movements in the water, were also sacred. The god Sobek, who bore the head of a crocodile, was linked to fertility, protection, and the power of the Nile. He was worshipped especially in regions where crocodiles were common, and temples were sometimes built near pools where live crocodiles, considered divine, were kept, fed, and revered. One famous mummified crocodile, discovered in a temple at Kom was found to have been buried with dozens of baby crocodiles, a quiet symbol of protection, strength, and renewal. The jackal, too, was closely tied to spiritual life. Its presence near desert edges and burial grounds led to its association with Anubis, god of mummification and guardian of the dead. Anubis, often shown with the head of a jackal, guided souls gently into the afterlife, watching over embalming rituals and ensuring the integrity of the tomb. His image, painted in dark hues, appears on coffin lids and shrine walls, a silent sentinel between worlds. Even smaller creatures held sacred roles. The scarab beetle, or dung beetle, was a potent symbol of creation and transformation. Observing how the beetle rolled its sphere of earth across the ground, the Egyptians saw in its actions a reflection of the sun's daily journey. This humble insect, tirelessly pushing its burden, became an emblem of the god Khipri, who renewed the sun each morning. Scarab amulets, carved with prayers or names, were placed on the chest of the deceased or worn by the living to symbolize rebirth and inner strength. Cattle, essential to agriculture and daily sustenance, were connected to gods of abundance and protection. The goddess Hathor, who brought joy and motherhood, was often depicted as a cow or with cow horns cradling the sun. In festivals honoring her, music and dancing would fill the air, and statues of the goddess were paraded across the river or through the fields. Her eyes, wide and serene, reflected kindness, fertility, and the nurturing aspects of divine presence. Birds of many kinds also carried symbolic meaning. Geese, herons, swallows, and vultures appeared in tomb paintings and amulets, each representing different aspects of the soul or spiritual protection. The vulture, for example, symbolized maternal care and was closely associated with the goddess Mut, protector of the pharaoh. The spread wings of the vulture goddess were often carved above doorways and ceilings, offering a silent embrace to those who passed beneath. The care Egyptians showed for animals was not limited to symbolism. In some cases, animals were raised in temple precincts, fed daily, and later mummified in rituals of reverence. Massive catacombs have been discovered beneath ancient sites, filled with the wrapped remains of cats, ibises, crocodiles, and bulls, each one buried with ceremony, not as a sacrifice, but as a sign of sacred continuity. To the Egyptians, animals were not only companions or workers, they were reminders of gods, of natural forces, of patterns greater than human understanding. Their behavior, their form, their presence in dreams or visions all held meaning. And in honoring these creatures, the people of Egypt honored the world itself, its beauty, its complexity, its quiet wisdom. As we leave behind these living symbols, we carry with us their stillness, their silent knowledge. In the next chapter of our journey, we'll step into the enduring art of memory, how the Egyptians honored their ancestors, preserved names, and told stories across generations, keeping the past alive through words, images, and sacred space. In the stillness of the Egyptian desert, where tombs lie nestled in hillsides and stone inscriptions shimmer softly under centuries of sun, there exists a quiet persistence, the enduring breath of memory. To the ancient Egyptians, remembrance was not simply a matter of honoring the past, it was a sacred responsibility, a way of sustaining life across time, ensuring that the soul continued its journey, nourished by the echoes of love, devotion, and spoken name. Central to this understanding was the concept of the name, or Ren. A person's name was far more than a label. It was part of the soul itself, a vital living element of one's identity. To speak someone's name was to keep them present. To forget it was to allow their spirit to fade into silence. Tombs, stelae, and offerings were inscribed not only with prayers and images, but always with names. And so long as a name remained visible, or was softly spoken by the living, the individual it belonged to continued, in some way, to exist. This belief is woven into the very structure of Egyptian writing. Names were often enclosed in cartouches, oval frames that symbolized protection and eternity. Kings had 5 names, each expressing an aspect of divine purpose, cosmic role, and earthly identity. But ordinary people, too, ensured their names were recorded on coffins, pottery, statues, and offering tables, surrounded by symbols of preservation and blessing. Ancestor worship in ancient Egypt was subtle but present. Families kept memories alive through regular rituals, offering bread, beer, incense, and flowers at tombs or small shrines, sometimes within the home itself. These were not grand ceremonies, but acts of gentle continuity. The dead were not viewed as separate from the living, but as part of a shared household. Their spirits, called Aku when glorified, were believed to have power, not only to observe the world of the living, but to influence it, bringing blessings, protection, or even gentle reminders when something was amiss. The false door, a common feature in tombs, was not merely decorative. It served as a symbolic threshold between the worlds, a space through which the spirit might pass, receiving offerings and maintaining connection with the family. On either side of the door, Inscriptions recorded the name and titles of the deceased, along with lists of offerings desired in the afterlife: bread, beer, meat, incense, linen. These lists were not just poetic, they were deeply meaningful, designed to feed the spirit through sacred words. Storytelling was another form of remembrance, soft, oral traditions passed from one generation to the next. Tales of wise scribes, brave heroes, or clever peasants were told around hearths and in courtyards, embedding moral lessons, humor, and wonder into the shared cultural memory. Some of these stories were eventually written down on papyri or painted onto tomb walls, blending entertainment with education, myth with gentle truth. In elite tombs, images of the deceased were painted or carved in scenes of everyday life: fishing, farming, embracing loved ones, sitting beside tables piled high with offerings. These were not merely artistic choices. They were spiritual affirmations, visual prayers that life in the afterworld would mirror the joys and stability of life on earth. The more detailed the depiction, the more vivid the continuation of the soul's journey. And nearby, always, the name, carved carefully, surrounded by protective signs, repeated like a whisper through time. The Book of the Dead, often buried with the deceased, also emphasized the importance of remembrance. Its spells included requests to the living: "O you who love life, who hate death, say my name, remember me, pour water for me." These soft appeals remind us that remembrance was not mournful, but active, an expression of care that transcended the limits of breath and bone. Even among royalty, the desire for remembrance was profound. Massive temples and statues were built not just for glory, but for memory. Each one bore inscriptions: "He who makes my name live again, I shall make his life sweet." These words invite all who pass to speak, to see, to acknowledge, to participate in the great quiet project of eternal memory. In Egypt, memory was not fixed in stone alone. It lived in gestures, in stories, in the rhythms of ritual. During the great feast of the beautiful Festival of the Valley, families would cross the Nile to visit the tombs of loved ones, bringing food, drink, and music. They would spend time there, speaking to the departed, cleaning the area, and sharing meals. It was not a somber day, but one of warmth and connection. In this tradition, we see the heart of Egyptian remembrance, not as grief, but as presence. Some tombs included letters to the dead, carved or written on pottery. In these messages, the living might ask for guidance, express frustration, or simply continue a conversation that had not ended. "Why have you forgotten me?" one letter asks, tenderly, "Come to me in my dreams." These words are filled not with despair, but with a yearning for continued closeness, the belief that the bond between souls could stretch beyond the veil of death. In all of this, the names, the prayers, the songs, the stories, we find a civilization gently dedicated to remembering. Memory, for the Egyptians, was not a burden, but a blessing. It kept families united, upheld cosmic order, and ensured that life flowed seamlessly into the next. To be remembered was to remain part of the world. To forget or be forgotten was the only true loss. And so, as we move forward, we carry these names with us: the known and the unknown, the kings and farmers, the mothers and scribes. Each one a thread in the long tapestry of time, held together not by power, but by care. In our next chapter, we will explore how the Egyptians approached aging, legacy, and the quiet wisdom of life's later seasons, where reflection, patience, and preparation took gentle precedence. In the soft light of evening, when the sun draped the Nile in gold, and the shadows grew long beside the palm trees, the people of ancient Egypt found beauty in life's slower rhythms. Just as the river flowed steadily from source to sea, so too did human life move through its seasons, from childhood to youth, from strength to stillness. And in old age, Egyptians saw not an ending, but a culmination. To grow old was to draw near to the gods, to carry within oneself the memories of many floods, many harvests, and many quiet mornings. It was a time of respect, of teaching, and of gently preparing the soul for its return to eternity. The elderly were honored within the household and the wider community. They were seen as wise, as close to the sacred, and often as the final storytellers of family lines. In a culture where lineage, memory, and tradition carried deep spiritual meaning, the role of elders was not diminished with age, it was amplified. Grandparents helped raise children, passed on teachings, and preserved the customs that anchored the household. Their presence brought stability, continuity, and gentle authority. Egyptian writings reflect this quiet esteem for the aged. In the instructions, a genre of wisdom literature that offered moral and practical advice, there is often a reverent tone toward old age. These texts encouraged patience, kindness, and attentiveness to the elderly, who were believed to carry spiritual weight as well as experience. Do not forget what has been told to you. A father might write to his son, "Respect your mother and your father, for their hands shaped you, and their love brought you into the light." Old age, while sometimes described as physically challenging, was rarely met with bitterness in Egyptian texts. Instead, it was accepted as a natural step in life's sacred journey. A hymn to the sun god Ra, written from the perspective of an elderly man, describes the weakening of limbs and the dimming of sight, yet still gives thanks for the warmth of the sun, for breath, for memory. The tone is one of gentle surrender, not to loss, but to transformation. In funerary texts and tomb inscriptions, individuals often reflected on their lives with quiet pride. They listed not their accomplishments in conquest or wealth alone, but their virtues, how they treated others, the fairness of their dealings, the kindness shown to the poor, the prayers offered to the gods. "I gave bread to the hungry." One inscription reads, "I was a husband gentle in speech, a father to the orphan, a friend to those in need." These were the legacies that mattered. The gentle impressions left upon the world, carved not in stone, but in the hearts of others. Practical preparations for the afterlife often began in these later years. A person might commission their tomb, arrange for their funerary goods, and ensure that their name would be preserved through inscriptions, stelae, or statues. Families worked together to prepare offerings and organize rituals. Far from being seen as morbid, these acts were thoughtful, a kind of spiritual housekeeping, guided by care and calm. To prepare for death was to affirm belief in life beyond it. Art from tombs and papyri often depicted the elderly in familiar roles, sitting among younger family members, reading or writing, or participating in ceremonies. Their hair was sometimes shown white, their postures stooped, yet always they were surrounded by symbols of peace and honor. In some texts, older individuals take on the role of teacher, passing sacred knowledge to disciples or children, ensuring that the wisdom of past generations continued to shape the future. Among the aged were also priests and scribes who had spent lifetimes in study and devotion. These elders, often seen as closest to the gods, were revered not only for what they knew, but for how they carried themselves. Their speech was measured, their movements deliberate. In the temples they participated in rituals with careful precision, their years having refined both their skill and their presence. To see an old priest tending to a statue, offering incense or reciting hymns, was to witness the embodiment of memory itself, the human link between divine order and the ever-turning present. Even the landscape of the afterlife reflected this gentle view of aging. In the field of reeds, The paradise envisioned by the Egyptians, the soul returned to a perfected version of life on earth. Fields were tilled without labor, trees bore fruit year-round, and families reunited in joy. The aged were not left behind, but restored, not to youth in the modern sense, but to a state of peace, balance and serenity. There the soul could continue its quiet journey, free of suffering, surrounded by those it had loved. In daily life, small rituals marked the passage of time. Birthdays were not always celebrated in the modern way, but anniversaries of significant events, including deaths and transitions, were observed with care. To mark the memory of a parent or grandparent, a family might leave flowers at a tomb, light a lamp, or prepare a favorite dish. These acts of remembrance kept the presence of the elder close, even as time moved forward. Ultimately, the Egyptians viewed aging as part of the divine structure of the world. Just as the sun rose and set, just as the river flooded and receded, so too did the human life unfold in seasons. Each stage had its beauty, each stage its place. To grow old was to become a vessel of stillness, to see more deeply into the patterns that surrounded all things. In the lines of the face, in the softness of step, there was wisdom, not shouted, but offered gently, like the hush of dusk or the first breath of dawn. As we move forward from here, we draw ever closer to the end of our journey. In the next chapter, we will reflect on the lasting harmony that bound all aspects of Egyptian life, a quiet thread of balance and beauty that shaped how they lived, how they died, and how they continue to inspire. In the hush of early morning, when the first light brushed the desert edge and the Nile glistened beneath a sky of soft rose and gold, the people of ancient Egypt rose not only to begin their daily tasks, but to continue their participation in something far greater than themselves. This something was Maat, a quiet, enduring presence that lay at the heart of the Egyptian worldview. Maat was not simply a goddess, though she was often personified with a single feather in her hair. Maat was a principle, a truth, a way of being. She represented order, balance, justice, and harmony, not imposed from above, but gently cultivated through thoughtful living. To live in accordance with Maat was to be in alignment with the world as it was meant to be. It meant honoring family and community, showing kindness to others, acting with fairness, and respecting the rhythms of nature and spirit. Maat was not enforced by strict codes or dramatic laws. Instead, it was upheld in countless quiet ways, through the honesty of a trade, the care of a prayer, the symmetry of a building, the intention behind a word spoken softly at the right moment. Maat shaped the legal system, where disputes were settled not by rigid punishment, but by seeking restoration and peace. Local officials, temple scribes, and judges were expected to embody her principles, to weigh evidence not just with the head, but with the heart. The image of scales, so often associated with the judgment of the dead, was just as meaningful in the world of the living. Justice was a balance, not a blade. It required listening, reflection, and the recognition that every action touched others. In art and architecture, Maat found expression in balance and clarity. Temples were built with axial precision, aligned to the cardinal directions and celestial movements. Statues were carved with symmetry and grace, their features idealized, not to deny individuality, but to reflect eternal truths. Hieroglyphic inscriptions followed ordered lines and measured proportions, each sign a miniature work of reverence. Even the positioning of offerings on an altar followed sacred patterns, not as superstition, but as a way of keeping things in harmony, honoring the gods and the subtle geometry of the world. Maat guided relationships as well. In wisdom literature, and household customs, it was taught that to be kind, to speak gently, and to act with generosity was to uphold the order of the universe. Parents taught their children to listen before speaking, to respect elders, and to be content with what they had. Pride, excess, and cruelty were not only frowned upon, they were seen as dangerous, for they disrupted the balance upon which all things depended. This understanding extended into the spiritual realm, especially in the journey through the afterlife. When the soul reached the hall of judgment, its heart, believed to hold the truth of a person's life, was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, free from guilt, it could pass into the field of reeds. If it was heavy, burdened by wrong, the soul would not continue. This was not a threat, but a reminder: live well, and your spirit will remain in harmony with the cosmos. The Pharaoh, as the highest servant of the gods, was seen as the upholder of Ma'at. His role was not merely to rule, but to maintain balance between heaven and earth, to ensure that temples were maintained, rituals performed, and justice upheld. His titles reflected this: beloved of Ma'at, Lord of the Two Lands, living Horus. Every decree, every monument, every public act was a reaffirmation of Egypt's central truth, that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of balance. Even in the natural world, Ma'at was visible. The regular flooding of the Nile, bringing fertile soil to the fields, this too was Ma'at. The rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, the migration of birds and the blooming of the lotus, all were seen as expressions of this sacred pattern. To live in awareness of these rhythms, to walk gently in the world, to give thanks and show restraint, this was to live in harmony with creation. Ma'at also shaped language and storytelling. Poets and scribes praised it in hymns and teachings. Speak only when your words are more beautiful than silence, one saying advised, a gentle reminder of the power and responsibility carried in every sentence. The preservation of memory, the care of the dead, the celebration of life, all were ways of protecting and honoring the balance that Ma'at required. In times of trouble, drought, unrest, uncertainty, the Egyptians looked not for conquest, but for restoration. They built, repaired, prayed, and remembered. To return to Ma'at was always possible, always encouraged. It was not a perfection to be achieved, but a path to be followed, again and again. Even today, thousands of years later, the symbols of Ma'at still speak. The feather, the scales, the calm gaze of a painted figure holding truth in her hands. These images remind us that there once was a civilization that did not seek control, but balance, not dominance, but continuity. They invite us to listen, to slow down, to reflect. As we move toward the final chapters of our journey, we carry this quiet wisdom with us, the deep, steady breath of a culture that found meaning not in force or haste, but in patience, order, and the graceful movements of the soul in tune with the sky. As the sun slipped each evening beneath the western horizon, casting long shadows over the Nile and turning the desert hills to soft gold, the ancient Egyptians saw not the end of a day, but the beginning of a sacred journey. The west, where the sun disappeared into the silence of night, became the symbolic gateway to the next world, a land not of dread, but of return. To die was to enter the embrace of the setting sun, to walk a path worn smooth by generations, and to step gently from one realm of order into another. Death, in Egyptian belief, was not a fall into darkness. It was a transition, a carefully guided passage from one form of life to another. It required reverence, attention, and preparation. For just as the soul was eternal, so too was the responsibility to ensure its safe journey, to clothe it in care, surround it with remembrance, and speak the words that would carry it forward. The process of death and burial began with ritual and intention. The body, once it had ceased to breathe, was tended by skilled embalmers, not only as technicians, but as sacred caretakers. These embalmers, often priests in their own right, treated the body with tenderness and ceremony. Over the course of many days, they washed it, anointed it with fragrant oils, and carefully removed and preserved the internal organs, placing each into canopic jars protected by the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, thought to house memory and morality, was often left in place or preserved with special care, for it would later be weighed in judgment. The brain, curiously, was removed and discarded, its significance less understood. The body was dried with natron, a natural salt, then wrapped in layer upon layer of linen, with amulets and prayers tucked between folds, each one offering protection, strength, or clarity for the soul's voyage. Once prepared, the body was placed in a coffin, often beautifully painted, with inscriptions of the deceased's name, titles, and spells for guidance. Sometimes, several coffins nested within one another, like gentle layers of the cosmos, an inner chamber for the soul, surrounded by the symbols of eternity. Scenes of gods and sacred animals adorned the sides. The face of the lid was painted with serene features, so the soul might recognize itself in peace. The funeral procession was a moment of both mourning and reverence. Family members, professional mourners, priests and musicians walked slowly through the fields or across the river, accompanying the deceased to their final resting place. Incense curled into the air, prayers were chanted, offerings were carried, food, drink, flowers, tools, and small statues called shabtis, who would serve the deceased in the field of reeds. At the tomb, final rituals were performed. One of the most important was the opening of the mouth ceremony, in which a priest touched the face and senses of the deceased with sacred instruments, a gesture meant to restore the soul's ability to see, speak, breathe, and receive offerings in the next life. It was not simply symbolic, it was a moment of reawakening, a breath before the next dawn. Inside the tomb, depending on status and means, walls were often decorated with scenes of daily life, sacred texts, and welcoming deities. The goal was not to freeze a life in time, but to ensure its continuation, to make the next world a place of familiarity and joy. Painted images showed fishing trips, banquets, music and laughter, family gatherings, and prayers offered in golden fields. The tomb was not a prison, but a home, carefully aligned with the stars, with false doors, offering tables, and storage niches filled with jars and baskets. The soul, now freed from the body, began its journey through the duat, the spiritual realm that lay beneath or beyond the earth. This journey was long, mysterious, and filled with trials. It echoed the sun god Ra's nightly passage through the underworld, facing serpents, darkness, and gates guarded by strange and fearsome beings. Yet the soul was not alone. It carried with it the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, passwords, and guidance, written on papyrus or painted on tomb walls. These were not grim warnings, but affirmations. I have not lied. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain. The soul recited these words as it moved steadily toward the Hall of Judgment. In the Hall of Two Truths, the heart was weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at. This was the soul's most intimate test. If the heart was found light, unburdened by wrongdoing, the soul was welcomed into the field of reeds, a perfect reflection of the world it had left behind. If the heart was heavy, it would be devoured by Amit, the devourer, and the soul would cease to exist. But this fate was rare, for the very act of preparation, of living with care and devotion, was meant to prevent such a loss. In the field of reeds, the soul found its place. Fields needed no plowing, food was abundant, loved ones were reunited. The sun rose always, and the river flowed with peace. The deceased lived again, not as a ghost, but as a complete being, surrounded by all they had loved and hoped for. There, they continued to offer prayers to the gods, to walk among papyrus groves and water lilies, to live in the presence of order and joy. And so in this cycle, from life to death to renewed life, the Egyptians saw not an end, but a continuation. Death was never final. It was a folding of the day into night, followed by another gentle dawn, and those who remained behind kept the memory alive through spoken names, offerings, and the soft brushing of dust from a stone carved long ago. In the next chapter of our journey, we will rest among the pyramids once more, not to examine their grandeur, but to feel the silence they hold. We'll walk the sands between stone and sky, and reflect on the timeless quiet that has surrounded Egypt's most enduring monuments for thousands of years. Rising gently from the pale sands of the desert, where the sky curves wide and unbroken above the horizon, the pyramids of ancient Egypt stand in enduring silence. Their edges, once sharp, are now softened by wind and time. Their surfaces, once polished to reflect the sun, now rest in golden dust. Yet their presence remains vast, quiet and certain. To stand among them is not to witness the ambition of rulers alone, but to feel the breath of a civilization that sought not only to build, but to last, to shape something that would outlive sorrow, war, and forgetting. The Giza Plateau, home to the most iconic of these pyramids, lies just west of modern Cairo, where city and desert meet. Here, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, alongside those of Khafre and Menkaure, still holds its place against the shifting winds. For over 4,500 years, these great tombs have watched the sun rise and set across the Nile, casting long shadows at dawn, glowing softly in the final light of day. Their shape, broad at the base, narrowing to a point, reflects the ancient Egyptian vision of ascent, of reaching from earth toward the realm of the gods. Though their interiors are quiet, cool, and often narrow, their spiritual architecture is vast. Each stone, carved and placed with patient precision, was part of a design meant not just to protect a body, but to guide a soul. The internal chambers and passageways were aligned with stars, particularly those of Orion and Sirius, constellations associated with Osiris and Isis, symbols of rebirth and eternal guidance. In this alignment, the Egyptians expressed not just reverence for the heavens, but confidence in a cosmic order that would receive and shelter the soul. Surrounding the pyramids are other markers of remembrance: masturbate tombs for nobles and officials, causeways that once carried funeral processions, small temples where offerings were made. The Great Sphinx, its face weathered but still serene, lies to the east, gazing toward the rising sun. Its lion body and human head form a riddle of form and meaning, part guardian, part mystery, part echo of a time when the boundary between stone and spirit felt thinner than it does today. For the ancient Egyptians, the pyramid was not a monument to death, but a vessel of transformation. Its massive shape was the earthly mirror of the primordial mound, the first land to rise from the waters of chaos at the dawn of creation. In building pyramids, they were not merely honoring kings, they were reenacting the very birth of the world, reminding themselves and their gods that life continued, rising again from silence and shadow. Though the most famous pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom, their influence lingered across centuries. Later dynasties built smaller step pyramids or constructed elaborate rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The essential purpose remained: to honor the dead, to protect the body, and to create a space where the soul could return and rest. But the true pyramid, the timeless triangle against the sky, remained a symbol of eternal presence, of quiet power held not through sound, but through stillness. To visit the pyramids is to encounter time in a different rhythm. The desert is wide and nearly silent. Footsteps echo softly against the stone. Wind moves through narrow corridors with a whispering breath. Birds circle high above. Tourists may come and go, voices rising and falling with the day, but beneath it all is a deeper hush, the kind that exists only in places long removed from haste. The stones themselves are worn, each one unique in size and shape, yet joined in purposeful formation. Some bear faint tool marks, traces of hands long gone. Others show graffiti from visitors of later ages, Greek, Latin, Arabic, names scratched into eternity by those who also stood in wonder. The pyramids do not answer these names. They simply endure, their silence both generous and profound. For the Egyptians, such endurance was not only desirable, it was sacred. To create something that would remain, through flood, fire, invasion and time, was to participate in the divine. These structures were not meant to outshine nature, but to align with it. The desert, with its vast openness and sunlit calm, was the perfect canvas. Here things did not rot. They waited, they rested. In the shadow of a pyramid, one feels not small but still. The sense of rush, so often present in modern life, fades. One begins to listen more closely, not for voices but for feeling. A weight settles, not heavy, but grounding. These are spaces where memory breathes, where the ambitions of ancient kings have softened into symbols, and where the hands of builders, farmers, stonecutters, overseers live on in the work they shaped. Though many of the treasures once housed within have long since vanished, carried off by time or tomb robbers, the heart of the pyramids remains untouched. Their meaning, their presence, their quiet, these cannot be taken. They are not museums, they are meditations carved in limestone. They are not answers, they are invitations. As we prepare to move into the closing chapters of our journey, we carry with us the stillness of these stone sentinels. Their endurance reminds us that true legacy is not always loud. Sometimes it is the shape of a shadow at noon, the curve of a slope against the sky, or the feeling of something vast, ancient and kind holding its breath, and waiting, always waiting, for someone to pause and remember. There is a calmness that lives in the curve of a river, a steady, unhurried motion that carries stories, silt and song. For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was far more than a body of water. It was the giver of life, the divider of worlds, the path of gods, and the most intimate expression of Maat in motion. Along its banks, cities rose and fields blossomed. In its floods, the rhythms of seasons were set, and in its gentle current, the people of Egypt saw the pulse of eternity. The Nile flowed from the heart of Africa, gathering tributaries and mysteries before curving northward through the dry lands of Egypt and emptying into the wide breadth of the Mediterranean Sea. This northward flow, unusual among the world's great rivers, gave Egypt a unique sense of orientation. Upper Egypt lay to the south, where the river narrowed through cliffs and cataracts. Lower Egypt lay to the north, where the Nile fanned into fertile branches and green delta. This reversal of expectation echoed Egypt's view of life and death, the west as the realm of the dead, the east for the living, everything defined not by static maps, but by motion and meaning. The annual flood, known as the inundation, was the Nile's greatest gift. Each year, around late summer, the river would rise and overflow its banks, pouring nutrient-rich silt across the flat floodplains. Farmers welcomed the waters with gratitude, for they renewed the soil, nourished the crops, and made life possible. The Egyptians did not fear the flood, they awaited it. They measured its rise with millimeters, carved into stone with careful marks, and recorded it with the attention of those who understood that abundance depended not on conquest, but on cooperation with nature's timing. This cycle shaped the Egyptian calendar into its three gentle seasons: Akhet, the season of flooding; Peret, the season of emergence and planting; and Shimu, the season of harvest and heat. Each phase of the river's behavior called forth a different rhythm of labor, ritual, and rest. Music was played to honor the returning waters. Offerings were made to Hapi, the god of the Nile's abundance, depicted as a round androgynous figure, overflowing with prosperity, bearing offerings of fruit, flowers, and grain. Villages and cities nestled close to the river's edge. Houses were built with the knowledge of when the waters would rise and recede. Canals carried the Nile's blessing deeper into the land, and irrigation ditches branched like veins through fields of wheat, barley, flax, and papyrus. The river was the pathway of commerce, the thread of ritual, and the spine of the kingdom. Boats moved steadily between towns, carrying grain, goods, letters, and people. Priests heading to temples, farmers bringing goods to market, scribes and messengers delivering scrolls between provinces. Travel on the Nile was not rushed. Boats moved with the wind and the current, their sails catching the air like the wings of birds. Painted scenes on tomb walls show boats filled with musicians, food, and family. River journeys as both transport and leisure, as sacred pilgrimages or festival processions. The river's movement mirrored the movement of the soul, gentle forward toward light or transformation. To the Egyptians, the Nile was also a mythic space. It was believed to be a reflection of the cosmic river in the heavens, the Milky Way, and its daily flow echoed the journey of the sun god Ra, who sailed across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. The river was thus both real and symbolic, earthly and divine, touched by gods, and yet familiar in every splash, every shorebird's cry, every reflection of moonlight on its surface. Temples lined the river like beads on a string. Some faced the water directly, their pylons rising from the mist of morning dew, catching the first light. Others were set back from the floodplain, reachable by long ceremonial causeways or processional routes. Pilgrimages to these temples often involved travel by boat, a practice rich in ritual, echoing the mythic voyages of the gods themselves. Statues of deities were sometimes placed aboard sacred barges, accompanied by priests and songs, paraded downriver to celebrate festivals, renew spiritual energy, or reenact cosmic events. The Nile also offered comfort in farewell. Tombs were often built on the west bank, the land of sunset and transition. Funeral processions would cross the river in quiet boats, carrying the deceased from the bustling world of the living to the silent embrace of the necropolis. Just as the sun crossed the sky, just as the river flowed from birth to sea, so too did the soul journey onward, not hurried, but held, carried by water and memory. Even today, the Nile continues to flow, slower now in places, its rhythms managed by dams and cities, but still bearing that ancient hush. Along its banks, farmers still tend their fields, children still swim in the warm shallows, and boats still move with the same gentle pace. The river remains a source of life, but also of connection, linking past and present, sacred and everyday, breath and story. To touch the Nile, to watch its surface ripple in sunlight, is to feel the pulse of something larger than history. A quiet presence that held an entire civilization in its arms, and still whispers, softly, in the reeds and breeze. In the next chapter, we'll enter the final pages of our journey, a soft reflection on what we've seen, what endures, and how the ancient world of Egypt still lives not only in stone, but in memory, imagination, and the peace it continues to offer. There is a certain calm that lingers in the memory of ancient Egypt, a hush that seems to settle over the mind, even when the noise of modern life continues all around. It's not only the stillness of the desert or the silence within temple walls, but something deeper, the stillness of a people who understood rhythm, who built a life not in haste but in harmony. They shaped their world with attention, patience, and care, and in doing so, they left behind more than monuments. They left a feeling, a presence that even now speaks in whispers through stone, sand, and story. What makes Egypt feel so eternal is not merely its age, but its coherence. For thousands of years, the same beliefs, symbols, and practices flowed like the river that sustained them. The same gods were honored, the same rituals were performed, the same hieroglyphs were carved, generation after generation, with only the softest of variations. In this slow evolution, we find stability, a sense of trust in the world's order and in the human place within it. From the soaring pyramids of the Old Kingdom to the painted tombs of Thebes, from the careful geometry of Karnak's columns to the delicate writing of a scribe's hand, everything the Egyptians created reflected a quiet reverence for balance. In form, in color, in proportion, they echoed the natural world, the curve of the lotus, the flight of birds, the cyclical return of the seasons. They understood that beauty was not something added to life, but something drawn from life itself when it is lived with awareness. This awareness extended not only to the physical world, but to the invisible threads that bind experience, memory, ancestry, meaning. The Egyptians kept the past close. They honored the dead not only in ceremony, but in everyday practice. They believed that to remember was to give life. And so names were written carefully, tombs were built with patience, offerings were placed with sincerity, no matter how simple or small. In this we see that ancient Egypt was not a civilization obsessed with death, as is sometimes believed, but one deeply committed to continuity. They saw death as a natural extension of life, a passage to another form of being. They prepared for it with calm, not fear, and in their vision of the afterlife, a world of green fields, familiar tasks, and loving reunion, they revealed what they valued most: connection, peace, and the sustaining rhythm of care. Perhaps it is this clarity of values that continues to draw us to Egypt's story. In a world often shaped by speed and novelty, Egypt reminds us of the power of duration, of things built to last, not just in stone, but in thought. Its wisdom was not shouted, but spoken in gestures, in a perfectly balanced statue, in the alignment of a temple with the stars, in a hymn that compared a mother's voice to the breeze across the reeds. Even their writing, the intricate dance of hieroglyphs, carried meaning beyond the literal. Each symbol was also a picture, a prayer, a bridge between image and idea. To read was not only to understand, it was to participate in the sacred. Their language was not rushed or stripped down, but cultivated like a garden where beauty and clarity bloomed together. Egypt's science, too, reflected this blend of the practical and the poetic. They measured time with water clocks and stars. They healed the body with herbs and hymns. They counted and calculated not to dominate, but to align, aligning homes with the river, temples with the sun, decisions with Mat. This was a civilization that found strength in structure, but grace within that strength, like the papyrus plant, tall and straight, yet swaying with the wind. And always, there was the Nile, the river that tied it all together. Its presence was constant, but never static. It rose and fell, it wandered and returned, it nourished without demanding, and reminded the people who lived along its banks that life is not a line, but a curve, turning, returning, and carrying us onward, gently. Now, As we prepare for the final part of our journey, we hold this spirit close. The spirit of Egypt is not locked in the past. It moves through time like the river itself, quiet, flowing, always present if we pause to listen. And in that pause, perhaps we find something of our own stillness reflected back. In the final chapter to come, we will bring this journey to a close, not with an end but with a moment of peace. A final reflection on the timeless gift that ancient Egypt continues to offer, the chance to slow down, to see clearly, and to feel, deeply and quietly, what it means to belong to something enduring. And so we reach the final bend in the river, the last fading light over the temple wall, the closing echo of a hymn once sung beneath vaulted stone. Our journey through ancient Egypt has followed many paths, through bustling markets and painted tombs, through myths whispered in moonlight and offerings left at the doorways of the dead. But now, as we rest beneath the sky that once watched over pharaohs and farmers alike, what remains most clearly is not a single image or event, but a feeling, a stillness that runs like the river, quiet and deep. For more than 3,000 years, Egypt was not merely a place, but a way of being. Its people lived not for change, but for continuity. They did not chase the fleeting, but honored the enduring. In their temples, they carved scenes not of conquest, but of balance, gods receiving offerings, kings bowing to divine order, farmers tending their fields beneath stars that returned, always in their season. In their art and writing, their medicine and music, they expressed the same truth again and again, that to live well is to live in rhythm, with one another, with the land, with time itself. This rhythm can still be felt in the wind that brushes the open courtyards of Luxor, in the shadows that stretch along the Giza plateau, in the face of a painted coffin that gazes forward not with fear, but with gentle clarity. Egypt's wisdom was never loud, it was layered, like the bands of linen wrapped carefully around the body of the dead. It was measured, like the proportions of a statue or the spacing of hieroglyphs on a sacred wall. And it was tender, hidden in the way a scribe addressed the gods, or a mother whispered the name of a protective goddess over her child. What makes Egypt timeless is not the scale of its monuments, but the intimacy of its spirit. The pyramids rise above the desert, yes, but beneath them lie doorways to memory, carved names, tucked offerings, moments frozen in the softness of human gesture. A bowl placed beside a bed, a song painted on a tomb, a prayer scratched on a potsherd. These are not acts of pride, they are acts of love. Even as Egypt changed, as dynasties shifted, as foreign rulers arrived, as new religions spread across its lands, something essential remained. The core of Maat, the reverence for the past, the trust in the river's return, and so the civilization did not end. It transformed, its language faded, but its voice remained, in stone, in story, and in the hearts of those who came after, who paused in wonder at its temples, who read its symbols by candlelight, who imagined its quiet world beneath the roar of modernity. Today we carry that world with us, not to recreate it, but to remember it. To remember what it means to move with care, to honor what has come before, to shape each gesture, each word, with the thoughtfulness of one who knows they are part of something larger than themselves. To study Egypt is to listen, not only with the mind, but with the spirit. It is to walk slowly through spaces that have waited thousands of years for our presence, and to understand that we are not so different from those who came before. We seek meaning, we tend to the ones we love, we tell stories, we name our children after stars, we light candles in the dark. As you drift now toward rest, know that you carry with you the quiet legacy of a people who understood that time need not be hurried. That beauty can be built not in moments, but in centuries, that the sacred lies not only in heavens and temples, but in the softness of routine, the grinding of grain, the folding of linen, the drawing of water from a well. This is Egypt's gift, not only its wonders, but its wisdom, the invitation to breathe, to wait, to walk in harmony with the world, and to remember that stillness is not emptiness. It is presence, and now, beneath the same stars that once rose above the Nile, we leave the ancient world not behind but within. Its spirit, carried gently in story and symbol, will move with you, quiet, enduring, and always just beneath the surface of things. Sleep well, traveler. You have wandered far and listened deeply. Egypt remains,